Section 45 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. Section 45. Martin Chuzzlewit. Old Chuzzlewit's plot succeeds. Where was the guilty Jonas, meanwhile? Shivering at every sound, listening for the news that Tig's body had been found in the wood, wondering if by any chance the crime might be laid on him. Already fate was weaving a net at his feet. The man from whom he had bought the poison to kill his father had fallen very ill, and his illness had repented of the part he had played. He had confessed to Westlock, whom, before he had fallen into wicked company, he had once known. Westlock sent for old Chuzzlewit, and he too was told the story of the purchased poison. Then together the three went to Jonas's house and brought him face to face with his accuser. Confronted with their evidence, Jonas gave himself up for lost, but old Chuffy, whom he had so abused, escaped the watchful eye of Sary Gamp and entered just in time to keep his promise to his dead master and to clear Jonas, the son. He told them how it had really happened, how Jonas had intended to kill his father, but how the latter's death had been due not to the poison which he had never taken, but to the knowledge of his son's wickedness. Jonas, in the reaction from his fear, laughed aloud and was abusively ordering them to leave when the door opened and the color suddenly left his cheeks. Policemen stood there, and at their head was Nadgett, the spy. In another moment there were handcuffs on his wrists, and he knew not only that the murder of Tig had been discovered, but that every action of his own on that fatal night had been traced, and that he was surely doomed to die on the gallows. When he realized that he was lost, he fell to the floor in pitiable fear. They put him in a wagon to take him to jail, but when they arrived there they found him motionless in his seat. He had swallowed some of his own poison, which he had carried in his pocket, and was as dead as any hangman could have made him. Old Chuzzlewit had yet another purpose to carry out before he left London, and for this purpose he asked Westlock to meet him in his rooms at a certain time next day. He sent for Tom Pinch and his sister Ruth and his grandson Martin and Mark Tapley, and last but not least for Pecksniff himself, all to meet him there at the same hour. All save Pecksniff arrived together, and greatly astonished most of them were, you may be sure, to see old Chuzzlewit so changed. For now the dull, bent look had vanished. His eyes were bright, his form erect, and every feature eager and full of purpose. Even Mary Graham scarcely knew what to make of it. As they sat wondering and waiting for old Chuzzlewit to speak, Pecksniff came hurriedly in, to start back as if at a shock of electricity. But he recovered himself and clasped his hands with a look of pious joy to see the old man safe and well. Then he looked around him and shook his head. "O vermin, O bloodsuckers," he said, "horde of unnatural plunderers and robbers, begone! Leave him and do not stay in a spot hallowed by the grey hairs of this patriarchal gentleman." He advanced with outstretched arms, but he had not seen how tightly old Chuzzlewit's hand clasped the walking stick he held. The latter, in one great burst of indignation, rose up, and with a single blow stretched him on the ground. Mark Tapley dragged him into a corner and propped him against the wall, and in this ridiculous position, cringing, and with his assurance all gone, Pecksniff listened, as did they all, to the old man's story. He told the assembled family how the curse of selfishness had seemed to him always to rest upon his family, how he had misunderstood Martin, his best loved grandson, and how he had seen Pecksniff doing his best to add to this bad feeling. He beckoned Martin to him and put Mary's hand in his, and he told how he had tested them both, and had at last resolved to see to what a length the hypocrisy of Pecksniff would lead him. How to this end he had pretended feebleness of mind, and had planned and plotted finally to expose Pecksniff and set all right. When he had finished, the door was opened, and Pecksniff, looking all shrunken and frowsy and yellow, passed out, never to enter again into the lives of any of them. There was a great and joyful gathering that night, when all these, so strangely united, took dinner together. Martin sat beside Mary, while Westlock walked home with Ruth, and, before they reached there, she had promised to be his wife. Martin and Mary were married soon, and old Chuzzlewit made Martin his heir. He also gave a home to poor Mercy, the wife of the dead Jonas. Tom Pinch lived a long and happy life in the home which Westlock made for Ruth, where he had a fine organ on which he played every day. Mark Tapley, of course, married the rosy landlady of the Blue Dragon, and settled down at the inn, which he renamed the Jolly Tapley. Charity Pecksniff succeeded in ensnaring her young man at last. The day they were to be married, however, he did not come to the church, but ran off to Van Diemen's Land, and she lived and died a vinegary, shrewish old maid. As for Pecksniff himself, having lost all his money in the Anglo-Bengalee Company, which, of course, went to pieces on Tig's death, he sank lower and lower, till at last, a drunken, squalid old man, he eked out a miserable existence, writing whining, begging letters to the very people whom he had once labored so hard to make unhappy. End of section 45.
Section 46 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Therese. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. Our Mutual Friend. What Happened to John Harmon? In London there once lived an old man named Harmon, who had made a great fortune by gathering the dust and ashes of the city and sorting it for whatever it contained of value. He lived in a house surrounded by great mounds of dust that he had collected. He was a hard-hearted man, and when his daughter would not marry as he wished, he turned her out of the house on a winter's night. The poor girl died soon after, and her younger brother, a boy of only 14, indignant at his father's cruelty, ran away to a foreign country, where for years he was not heard of. The old man, hard-hearted as he was, and though he never spoke of the son save with anger and curses, felt this keenly, for in his own way he had loved the boy. A Mr. Boffin was foreman of Harmon's dust business, and both he and his wife had loved the two children. Being kind and just people, they did not hesitate to let the father know how wicked they considered his action, and they never ceased to grieve for the poor little John who had run away. So, though they did not guess it, the old man made up his mind they were an honest and deserving pair. One morning the dust collector was discovered dead in his bed, and then it was found that he had left a very curious will. The will bequeathed all his vast fortune to the son who had run away, on one condition, that he marry a young lady by the name of Bella Wilfer, the daughter of a poor London clerk. The son had never seen Bella in his life, and in fact the old man himself had seen her only a few times, and that was a long, long time before, when she was a very little girl. He was sitting in the park one Sunday morning, and the baby Bella, because her father would not go the exact way she wanted, was screaming and stamping her little foot. Old Mr. Harmon, having such a stubborn temper himself, admired it in the little child, and came to watch for her. Then, for some strange reason, which nobody ever could guess, he had put the baby's name in his will, declaring that his son John should get his money only by marrying this little girl. And the will declared, moreover, that if the son, John Harmon, should die, or should refuse to marry Bella, all the fortune should go to Mr. Boffin. The lawyers had great trouble in finding where John Harmon was, but finally they did so, and received word that he would return at once to England. The ship he sailed on reached London, but the passenger it carried did not appear. A few days later a riverman named Hexam found a body floating in the river Thames, which flows through the middle of London. In his pockets were the letters the lawyer had written to John Harmon, and there seemed no doubt that the unfortunate young man had been murdered and his body thrown into the river. The night the body was found, while it lay at the police station, a young man, very much excited, came and asked to see it. He would not tell who he was, and his whole appearance was most wild and strange. The police wondered, but they saw no reason to detain the stranger, so after looking at the body he went away again very hastily. A great stir was made about the case, and the police tried their best to discover the murderer, but they were unsuccessful. Then it occurred to them that there was something suspicious in the appearance of the young man that night. They tried to find him, but he seemed to have disappeared. At last the fortune was turned over to Mr. Boffin, and all but a few people thought no more about the murder. Now, it was not really true that John Harmon had been drowned. This is what had happened. The young man had come back to England unwillingly, though he was coming to such wealth. Having left his father so long before in anger, he hardly liked to touch the money, and he dreaded having to marry a young lady he had never seen, with whom all his life he might be most unhappy. On the ship was a seaman, about his own age, whose face somewhat resembled his own. With this man Harmon became friendly, and before the ship reached England he had told him his trouble and his dread. The other proposed that Harmon disguise himself in sailor's clothes, go into the neighbourhood where Miss Bella Wilfer lived, and see if she was one whom he could love. Now the man whom Harmon was thus trusting was a villain, who, while he had been listening to the other's story, had been planning a crime against him. He had made up his mind to kill Harmon, and, as he looked so much like him, to marry Bella himself and claim the fortune. Near the docks where the ship came in was a sailors' boarding house owned by a riverman of bad reputation named Rugg Riderhood. Ryder had once been the partner of Hexam, the man who found the floating body, but one day he was caught trying to rob a live man, and Hexam had cast him off. The seaman took Harmon to this house, and there he secretly got from Riderhood some poison. Last he persuaded Harmon to change clothes with him. All that remained now was to get rid of the real Harmon. To do this he put the poison in a cup of coffee, and Harmon, drinking this, became insensible. The lodging house hung out over the river, and the wicked man had intended throwing the other's body, dressed now in seaman's clothing, into the water. But fate was quickly to spoil his plan. He and some others fell to quarrelling over the money found in the clothing of the unconscious man. The result was a desperate fight, and when it was over there were two bodies thrown from the window into the Black River, the drugged man and the seaman who had planned his murder. The shock of the cold water brought the drugged Harmon to his senses. He struck out, and after a terrible struggle succeeded in reaching shore. The exposure and the poison made him very ill, and he lay abed in an inn for some days. While he was lying helpless, there the drowned body of the seaman was found by Hexam the riverman. As it wore the clothes of John Harmon and had his papers in his pockets, everyone supposed, of course, that it was the body of the missing heir. The first thing John Harmon saw after he was well enough to walk was a printed notice announcing the finding of his own dead body, which gave him a very queer sensation. Lying there he had had time to think over the adventure, and he had guessed pretty nearly how it all had happened. He went at once to the police station to look at the corpse, and saw it was that of his false friend who had tried to lure him to his death. So it was the real John Harmon who had so excitedly appeared that night to the police inspectors and had vanished immediately, and whom they had searched for so long in vain, under the suspicion that he himself was the murderer. He had a very good reason for not letting the police find him, too. Now that the world considered him dead, he had determined before he came to life to carry out his first plan and to find out for himself just what kind of person the Bella Wilfer he was expected to marry was, and whether Mr. and Mrs. Boffin, who had been so kind to him in his childhood, would still be as true to his memory in their wealth. For this reason he did not correct the error that had been made. He took the name of John Rokesmith, and to get acquainted with Bella, hired lodgings in her own father's house. Mr. Wilfer was a clerk for a Mr. Veneering, a man who had made a big fortune in the drug business and wanted now to get into Parliament. Everything the Veneerings had was brand new. They spent a great deal of money entertaining society people at dinners, but Mr. Veneering spent very little on his clerks. Bella's father, though he was always as happy as a cherub, was so poor that he never had been able to buy a whole new suit at once. His hat was shabby before he could afford a coat, and his trousers were worn before he got to new shoes. So he was glad enough indeed to get a lodger. Mr. and Mrs. Boffin, to be sure, now had the great fortune. They bought a fine house, and everybody called Mr. Boffin the Golden Dustman, because he was so rich. Mrs. Boffin wore velvet dresses, and Mr. Boffin, thinking now that he was rich, he ought to know a great deal about books, bought a big volume of The History of the Roman Empire, and hired a man with a wooden leg, who kept a ballad shop near by, to come and read to him in the evenings. But in spite of all their fine things, Mr. and Mrs. Boffin remained the same good, kind-hearted couple they had always been. John Harmon, or John Rokesmith as he now called himself, soon found this out, for he cleverly got a position as Mr. Boffin's secretary taking charge of all his papers and preventing many dishonest people from cheating him. And Mr. and Mrs. Boffin, never suspecting who he really was, instead of secretary, called him "our mutual friend," and soon grew fond of him. Nor did they forget Bella Wilfer, for whose disappointment at not getting the rich husband she had expected they felt very sorry, and soon invited her to live with them. Bella was a good-tempered, pretty girl, though inclined to be somewhat selfish and spoiled, and she was not sure, after all, that she would have liked a husband who had been willed to her like a dozen silver spoons. So she did not grieve greatly, and accepted Mr. and Mrs. Boffin's offer gratefully. So now the secretary, John Rokesmith, beside being constantly with Mr. and Mrs. Boffin, whom he had always loved, had a chance to see Bella every day, and he was not long in finding out that it would be very easy, indeed, for him to fall in love with her. End of section 46. Section 47 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. Our Mutual Friend, Lizzie Hexam and the Doll's Dressmaker. Hexam, the riverman who had found the body floating in the Thames, made a living by watching in his boat for drowned bodies and getting any rewards that might be offered for finding them. He had 2 children, a daughter, Lizzie, who used to row the boat for him, and a younger son, Charlie. Lizzie was a beautiful girl and a good daughter, and she never ceased to beseech her father to quit this ghastly business. She saved every cent she could get to give her brother some schooling, and kept urging the boy until he left home and became a teacher in a respectable school. For her own part, she chose to stay by her father, hoping, in spite of her hatred of his calling, to make him sometime something better. The night Hexam found the body, the lawyers who had had the Harmon will in charge came to his house to see about it. One of them, a careless young man by the name of Eugene Wrayburn, was greatly struck with the beauty of Lizzie and pitied her because of the life she was obliged to live, and this interest in her made him even more deeply interested in the case of the odd will and the strange murder. Now Mr. and Mrs. Boffin, since they were rich, had offered a great reward for the arrest of the murderer of John Harmon. To get this reward, and at the same time to avenge himself on his old partner Hexam for casting him off, Rogue Riderhood went to the lawyers and declared that it was Hexam himself who had really killed the man whose body he had found. Riderhood swore that Hexam had confessed the crime to him. Wrayburn, knowing what a shock this charge against her father would be for Lizzie, went with the officers sent to seize him, but they made no arrest, for that night Hexam himself was drowned by accidentally falling from his own boat. But the false charge against him lay heavy on Lizzie's mind. She hated the river and all that was connected with it, and soon found herself a decent lodging in another part of London. Here she lived with a weird little dwarf of a girl, so deformed that she could scarcely walk at all. "I can't get up," she used to say to strangers, "because my back's bad and my legs are queer." She had an odd face with sharp gray eyes, and her wits were sharper yet. She worked at the strangest trade in the world. She had visiting cards on which was printed, "Miss Jenny Wren, Doll's Dressmaker. Dolls attended at their own residence." She was really and truly a doll's dressmaker, and sat all day long making tiny frocks out of silk and ribbon. Every evening she would hobble out to the door of the theatre or of a house where a ball was going on and wait until a lady came out in a beautiful costume. Then she would take careful note of it and go home and dress a doll just like it. She even made a minister doll in clerical collar and surplice and used to rent him out for doll weddings. But in spite of her trade she disliked children, because the rude ones of the neighborhood called her names through her keyhole and mimicked her bent back and crooked legs. "Don't talk to me of children," she often said. "I know their tricks and their manners." And when she said this she would make a fierce little jab in the air with her needle, as if she were putting out somebody's eyes. Jenny Wren had a miserable drunkard of a father whom she called her "troublesome child." "He is enough to break his mother's heart," she would say when he staggered in. "I wish I had never brought him up. Ugh, you muddling, disgraceful, prodigal old son! I can't bear to look at you. Go into your corner this minute." And the wretched creature, whining and maudlin, would shuffle into his corner in disgrace, not daring to disobey her. The odd little doll's dressmaker was cheerful and merry with all her trials, and loved Lizzie Hexam very much. Raeburn, the young lawyer, used to come to see them, but she did not approve of him. She saw almost before Lizzie did herself that the latter was falling in love with Raeburn, and the wise little creature feared that this would only bring pain to Lizzie, because she was an uneducated girl and Raeburn a gentleman who, when he married, would be expected to marry a lady far above Lizzie's station. Lizzie knew this too, but she could not help loving Raeburn. And as for the lawyer, he thought nothing of what the outcome might be. Meanwhile, Lizzie's brother Charlie, for whom she had worked so hard, was doing well at school, but now that he was getting up in the world he had turned out to be a selfish boy and was afraid that his sister might draw him down. One day he came to visit her, bringing with him the master of his school. The master's name was Headstone. He was a gloomy, passionate, revengeful man who dressed always in black and had no friends. Unfortunately enough, the first time he saw Lizzie he fell in love with her. It was unfortunate in more ways than one, for Lizzie disliked him greatly, and he was, as it proved, a man who would stop at nothing, not even at the worst of crimes, to attain an object. When Lizzie's brother found Headstone wanted to marry her, in his selfishness he saw only what a fine thing it would be for himself, and when she refused, he said many harsh things, and finally left her in anger, telling her she was no longer a sister of his. This was not the worst either, for she knew Headstone had been made almost angry by her dislike, and she was in dreadful fear lest he do harm to Eugene Raeburn, whom he suspected she loved. In her anxiety, Lizzie left her lodging with the doll's dressmaker, and found employment in a paper mill in a village on the river, some miles from London, letting neither Raeburn nor Headstone know where she had gone. The schoolmaster imagined that the lawyer, whom he now hated with a deadly hatred, knew where she was, and in order to discover if he visited her, he began to dog the other's footsteps. At night, after teaching all day in school, Headstone would lie in wait outside the lawyer's door, and whenever he came out would follow him. Raeburn soon discovered this and delighted to fool his enemy. Every night he would take a new direction and lead his pursuer for hours about the city, so that in a few weeks Headstone became almost insane with murderous anger and disappointment. So things went on for a long while. Lizzie continued to love Eugene Raeburn, who kept trying in every way to find her. Headstone, the schoolmaster, kept watching him and meditating evil. The little doll's dressmaker worked on cheerily every day in the city, and in their fine house Mr. and Mrs. Boffin grew fonder and fonder of Miss Bella, whom John Rokesmith, the secretary, thought more beautiful every day. End of section 47. Section 48 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Therese. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. Our Mutual Friend, The Rise and Fall of Silas Wegg. The wooden-legged ballad seller whom Mr. Boffin had hired to read to him was a sly, dishonest rascal named Silas Wegg, who soon made up his mind to get all the money he could out of his employer. There is an old story of a camel who once asked a shopkeeper to let him put his nose in at the shop door to warm it. The shopkeeper consented, and little by little the camel got his head, then his neck, then his shoulders, and at last his whole body into the shop, so that there was no room for the poor shopkeeper, who had to sit outside in the cold. Wegg soon began to act like the camel, and took such advantage of easy-going Mr. Boffin that the latter at last let him live rent-free in the house amid the dust heaps, which he himself had occupied before he got old Harmon's money. Wegg imagined the mounds contained treasures hidden by the old man, and thought it would be a fine thing to cheat Mr. Boffin out of them. So every night he spent hours prodding the heaps. Finally he persuaded a Mr. Venus, a man who had been disappointed in love, and made a melancholy living by stringing skeletons together on wires, to become his partner in the search. One day Wegg really did find something. It was a parchment hidden in an empty pump, and he soon saw that it was the second will of old Harmon's, later than the one already known, leaving the whole fortune, not to the son at all, but to the Crown. When Wegg saw this, his hypocritical soul swelled with joy, for he thought, sooner than give up all the money to the Crown, Mr. Boffin would pay him a great deal to destroy this new will. He was such a rascal himself that it never occurred to him that maybe Mr. Boffin would prefer to be honest. He took it for granted everybody else was as bad as he was himself, yet all the while he tried to make himself believe that he was upright and noble in all he did, as hypocrites generally do. The only point Wegg could not make up his mind about was how much he could squeeze out of his benefactor, Mr. Boffin. At first he had thought of asking for half, but the more he hugged his secret the lesser the half seemed. At last he determined to demand for himself, as the price for giving up the will, all but a very small share of the whole fortune. Now Mr. Venus, though he had yielded at first to the rosy temptations of Wegg, was after all quite honest at heart, and his conscience troubled him so that at last he went and told Mr. Boffin all about Wegg's discovery. The Golden Dustman at first thought Mr. Venus had some underhanded plan, so he pretended he was terribly frightened for fear of Wegg and the will he had found. As a matter of fact, sly old Mr. Boffin was not afraid in the least, because he knew something that neither Wegg nor Venus nor even John Rokesmith, the secretary, knew. This was, that the old original dustman, Harmon, had made still a third will, later than either of the others. The first will found was the one that had called the son back to England to marry Bella. The second will was the one leaving all his fortune to the crown, which Wegg had found in the empty pump. The third and last one gave all the money to Mr. Boffin, no matter whom the son married, and gave none to any one else. And this third and last will, the one that was the true will, the Golden Dustman had long ago found himself, buried in a bottle in one of the dust heaps. Mr. Boffin had never told anyone about this last will, because he had all the fortune anyway. Now, however, seeing how Wegg had planned to act, he was very glad he had found it, and when he was convinced that Mr. Venus was really honest and wanted no reward whatever, Mr. Boffin determined to fool the rascally Wegg up to the very last moment. Wegg's plan was not to demand the money until he had fully searched all the dust mounds. Mr. Boffin spurred Wegg on in this regard by making him read to him in the evening from a book called The Lives of Famous Misers, which he had bought, about the famous Mr. Dancer who had warmed his dinner by sitting on it and died naked in a sack, and yet had gold and banknotes hidden in the crevices of the walls and in cracked jugs and teapots; of an old apple woman in whose house a fortune was found wrapped up in little scraps of paper; of Vulture Hopkins and Blueberry Jones, and many others whose riches after their death were found hidden in strange places. While Wegg read, Mr. Boffin would pretend to get tremendously excited about his dust mounds, so that Wegg grew surer and surer there must be riches hidden in them. Finally, the Golden Dustman sold the mounds and had them carted away little by little, Wegg watching every shovelful for fear he would miss something. Mr. Boffin hired a foreman to manage the removal of the dust, who wore Wegg down to skin and bone. He worked by daylight and torchlight, too, just as Wegg, tired out by watching all day in the rain, would crawl into bed. The foreman, like a goblin, would reappear and go to work again. Sometimes Wegg would be waked in the middle of the night, and sometimes kept at his post for as much as 48 hours at a stretch, till he grew so gaunt and haggard that even his wooden leg looked chubby in comparison. At last he could not keep quiet any longer, and he told Mr. Boffin what he had found. Mr. Boffin pretended the most abject dread. Wegg bullied and browbeat him to his heart's content, and ended by ordering him, like a slave, to be ready to receive him on a certain morning, and to have the money ready to pay him. When he went to the fine Boffin house to keep this appointment, he entered insolently whistling, and with his hat on. A servant showed him into the library where Mr. Boffin and the secretary sat waiting, where the secretary at once astonished him by taking off the hat and throwing it out of the window. In another moment Wegg found himself seized by the cravat, shaken till his teeth rattled, and pinned in a corner of the room, where the secretary knocked his head against the wall while he was told in a few words what a scoundrel he was. When he learned that the will he had discovered was worthless paper, Wegg lost all his bullying air and cringed before them. Mr. Boffin was disposed to be merciful, and offered to make good his loss of his ballad business, but Wegg, grasping and mean to the last, set its value at such a ridiculously high figure that Mr. Boffin put his money back into his pocket. Then, at a sign from John Rokesmith, one of the servants caught Wegg by the collar, hoisted him on his back, ran down to the street with him, and threw him into a garbage cart, where he disappeared from view with a tremendous splash. And that, so far as this story is concerned, was the end of Silas Wegg. End of section 48. Section 49 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Therese. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. Our Mutual Friend, Bella and the Golden Dustman. It was not long before John Rokesmith, the secretary, was very much in love with Bella indeed. Bella saw this plainly, but the fine house and costly clothes had quite spoiled her, and thinking him only a poor secretary and her father's lodger, she treated him almost with contempt. Yet he would not tell her who he was, for he did not want her to marry him merely because of the money it would bring her. She hurt his feelings often, but in spite of it she could not help being attracted to him. He had a way, too, of looking at her that made her feel how proud and unjust she was, and sometimes made her quite despise herself. But having had a taste of the pleasures and comforts that wealth would bring, Bella had quite determined when she married to marry nobody but a very rich man. Mr. and Mrs. Boffin both noticed how changed she was growing from her own sweet self, and regretted it, for they liked Bella and they liked the secretary too, and they could easily see that the latter was in love with her. One day Mrs. Boffin went to the secretary's room for something. As she entered, Rokesmith, who was sitting sadly over the fire, looked up with a peculiar expression that told the good woman all in a flash who he was. "I know you now," she cried. "You're little John Harmon." In the joy and surprise she almost fainted, but he caught her and set her down beside him. Just then in came Mr. Boffin, and the secretary told them the whole story, and how he now loved Bella and would not declare himself because of her contempt. Both Mr. and Mrs. Boffin were so glad to know he was really alive they fell to crying with joy. The Golden Dustman declared that no matter how the last will read, John should have the fortune for his own. Rokesmith, or Harmon, at first refused to do this, but Mr. Boffin swore that if he did not, he himself would not touch the money and it would have to go to the Crown anyway. So at last it was agreed that Mr. Boffin should keep a small portion for his own, but that the other should take all the rest. Mr. Boffin wanted to tell everybody the truth at once, but John would not let them. You see, he wouldn't marry Bella for anything unless she loved him for himself alone, and she was growing so fond of riches, and there seemed little chance of this happening. Nevertheless, they believed that at heart Bella was good and sweet, if they could only get her to her real self, so Mr. Boffin that moment made a plan. He determined to show Bella how much unhappiness misused riches could cause, and how too much money might sometimes spoil the kindest and best people. As a lesson to her in this, he was to pretend gradually to turn into a mean, hard-hearted miser. They agreed that he should begin to treat the secretary harshly and unjustly in Bella's presence, feeling sure that her true self would stand up for him when he was slighted, and be kinder to him when he seemed poorest and most friendless. The Golden Dustman began the new plan that very night. Every day he made himself act like a regular brown bear, and every evening he would say, "I'll be a grizzlier old growler tomorrow." He made the secretary slave from morning till night, and found fault with him and sneered at his poverty and cut down his wages. Each afternoon when he went walking with Bella, Mr. Boffin would make her go into bookshops and inquire if they had any book about a miser. If they had, he would buy it no matter what it cost, and lug it home to read. He began to drive hard bargains for everything he bought, and all his talk came to be about money and the fine thing it was to have it. "Go in for money, my dear," he would say to Bella. "Money's the article. You'll make money of your good looks, and of the money Mrs. Boffin and me will leave you, and you'll live and die rich. That's the state to live and die in. Rich!" Bella was greatly shocked at the sorrowful change in Mr. Boffin. Wealth began to look less lovely when she saw him growing so miserly. She began to wonder if she herself might ever become like that, too, and sometimes, when she thought how kind and generous the old Mr. Boffin had been, she fairly hated money and wished it had never been invented. There was an old woman who peddled knitting work through the country whom Mr. and Mrs. Boffin had befriended, and to whom they had given a letter to carry wherever she went. This letter asked whoever should find her, if she fell sick, to let them know. The old woman fell and died one day by the roadside near the spot where Lizzie Hexam was now living, and Lizzie, finding the letter, wrote about it to Mr. and Mrs. Boffin. They sent the secretary and Bella to make arrangements for the poor woman's burial, and in this way Bella met Lizzie and became her friend. Lizzie soon told her all her story, and Bella, seeing how unselfishly she loved, began to think her own ambition to marry for money a mean and ignoble thing. She thought how patient and kind the secretary had always been, and knowing he loved her, wished heartily that her own coldness had not forbidden him to tell her so. One day Mr. Boffin's pretended harsh treatment of his secretary seemed to come to a climax. He sent for him to come to the room where Mrs. Boffin and Bella sat, and made a fearful scene. He said he had just heard that he, Rokesmith, had been presuming on his position to make love to Bella. A young lady who wanted to marry money, who had a right to marry money, and who was very far from wanting to marry a poor beggar of a private secretary. He threw the wages that were due Rokesmith on the floor and discharged him on the spot, telling him the sooner he could pack up and leave, the better. Then, at last, in the face of this apparent meanness and injustice, Bella saw herself and Mr. Boffin's money and John Rokesmith's love and dignity all in their true light. She burst out crying, begged Rokesmith's forgiveness, told Mr. Boffin he was an old wretch of a miser, and when the secretary had gone, she said Rokesmith was a gentleman and worth 1,000,000 Boffins, and she would not stay in the house a minute longer. Then she packed up her things and went straight to her father's office. All the other clerks had gone home, for it was after hours, and she put her head on his shoulder and told him all about it. And while they were talking, in came John Rokesmith, and seeing her there alone with her father, rushed to her and caught her in his arms. "My dear, brave, noble, generous girl," he said, and Bella, feeling all at once that she had never been quite so happy in her life, laid her head on his breast as if that were the one place for it in all the world. They had a talk together and then walked home to Mr. Wilfer's poor little house, Bella's father agreeing that she had done exactly the proper thing, and Bella herself feeling so happy now in having John Rokesmith's love that she cared not a bit for the fine mansion and clothes and money of the Boffins, which she had left forever. A few days later John Rokesmith and Bella were married and went to live in a little furnished cottage outside of London, where they settled down as happy as two birds. End of section 49. Section 50 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Therese. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. Our Mutual Friend. The End of the Story. While these things were happening at Mr. Boffin's house, Eugene Wrayburn, with Headstone the schoolmaster watching him like a hawk, had never left off trying to find where Lizzie Hexam had gone. At length, through the troublesome child of the little doll's dressmaker, he learned the name of the village where she was living, and went at once to see her. Headstone followed close behind him, and when, from his hiding-place, he saw how glad Lizzie was to see the lawyer, he went quite mad with jealousy and hate, and that moment he determined to kill Wrayburn. It happened that Rugg Riderhood was then working on the river that flowed past the village, where he tended a lock. The schoolmaster, in order to turn suspicion from himself in case anyone should see him when he did this wicked deed, observing carefully how Riderhood was dressed, got himself clothes exactly like the lock tender's, even to a red handkerchief tied around his neck. In this guise, with murder in his heart, he lay in wait along the riverside till Wrayburn passed one evening, just after he had bade good night to Lizzie Hexam. The schoolmaster crept up close behind the lawyer and struck him a fearful, crashing blow on the head with a club. Wrayburn grappled with him, but Headstone struck again and again with the bloody weapon, and still again as the other lay prostrate at his feet, and dragging the body to the bank threw it into the river. Then he fled. Lizzie Hexam had not yet turned homeward from the riverside. She heard through the night the sound of the blows, the faint moan, and the splash. She ran to the spot, saw the trampled grass, and, looking across the water, saw a bloody face drifting away. She ran to launch a boat, and rowed with all her strength to overtake it. But for her dreadful life on the river with her father she could not have found the drowning man in the darkness. But she did, and then she saw it was the man she loved. One terrible cry she uttered, then rowed with desperate strokes to the shore, and with superhuman strength carried him to a nearby inn. Wrayburn was not dead, but was dreadfully disfigured. For many days he hovered between life and death. Jenny Wren, the doll's dressmaker, came, and she and Lizzie nursed him. As soon as he could speak, he made them understand that before he died he wanted Lizzie to marry him. A minister was sent for, and with him came John Rokesmith and Bella. So the sick man was married to Lizzie, and from that hour he began to get better, till before long they knew that he would recover. Meanwhile, not waiting to see the result of his murderous attack, Headstone had fled down the river bank to the hut where Riderhood lived, and there the villainous lock tender let him rest and sleep. As the schoolmaster tossed in his guilty slumber, Riderhood noted that his clothes were like his own. He unbuttoned the sleeping man's jacket, saw the red handkerchief, and, having heard from a passing boatman of the attempted murder, he guessed that Headstone had done it, and saw how he had plotted to lay the crime on him. When the schoolmaster went away, Riderhood followed him, watched him change clothes in the bushes, and rescued the bloody garments the other threw away. With these in his hands, he faced the schoolmaster one day in his classroom, and made him promise, under threat of exposure, to come that night to the hut by the lock. Headstone was afraid to disobey. When he came, Riderhood told him he must give him money at once, or he would follow him till he did. Headstone refused, and, as the other had threatened, when he started back to London, he found the lock tender by his side. He returned to the hut, and the other did the same. He started again, and again the other walked beside him. Then Headstone, turning suddenly, caught Riderhood around the waist and dragged him to the edge of the lock. "Let go," said Riderhood. "You can't drown me." "I can," panted Headstone, "and I can drown myself. I'll hold you living, and I'll hold you dead. Come down." Riderhood went over backward into the water, and the schoolmaster upon him. When they found them, long afterward, Riderhood's body was girdled still with the schoolmaster's arms, and they held him tight. This was the awful end of the two wicked men whom fate had brought into Lizzie's life. All this time, of course, Bella had been believing her husband to be very poor. At first he had intended to tell her who he was on the day they were married, but he said to himself, "No, she's so unselfish and contented. I can't afford to be rich yet." So he pretended to get a position in the city at small wages. Then, after a few months, he thought it over again, and he said to himself, "She's such a cheerful little housewife that I can't afford to be rich yet." And at last a little baby was born to Bella, and then they were so happy that he said, "She's so much sweeter than she ever was that I can't afford to be rich just yet." But meantime Bella was imagining that Mr. Boffin was a cruel old miser, and Mr. Boffin didn't like this, so John agreed that he would tell her all about it. But first he got Bella to describe exactly the kind of house she would like if they were very, very rich, and when she told him, he and Mr. Boffin had the Boffin mansion fixed over in just the way she had said, with a nursery with rainbow-colored walls and flowers on the staircase, and even a little room full of live birds, and a jewel box full of jewels on the dressing-table. Fate, however, had arranged even a greater trial of Bella's love for him than all the others. As they walked together on the street one day, they came face to face with a man who had been in the police office on the night the body, which everyone believed to be John Harmon's, had lain there. He had seen the entrance of the agitated stranger, and had helped the police in their later vain search for Rokesmith. Now he at once recognized Bella's husband as that man who the police believed had probably committed the murder. Rokesmith knew the man had recognized him, and when they got home he told Bella that he was accused of killing the man the Harmon will had bidden her marry. But nothing now could shake her faith in him. "How dare they?" she cried indignantly. "My beloved husband!" He caught her in his arms at that, and while he held her thus the officers entered to arrest him. Rokesmith found the matter very easy to explain to the satisfaction of the police, but he told Bella nothing as yet, and, trusting and believing in him absolutely, she waited in great wonder. Next day he told her he had a new position, and that now they must live in the city, where he had taken a furnished house for them. They drove together to see it. Strangely enough, it seemed to be in the same street as Mr. Boffin's house, and stranger yet, the coach stopped at Mr. Boffin's own door. Her husband put his arm around her and drew her in, and she saw that everything was covered with flowers. As he led her on, she exclaimed in astonishment to see the little room full of birds, just as she had wished. Suddenly her husband opened a door, and there was Mr. Boffin, beaming, and Mrs. Boffin shedding tears of joy and folding her to her breast as she said, "My dearie, 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 wife of John and mother of his little child, my loving, loving, bright, bright, pretty, pretty, welcome to your house and home, my dearie." Then, of course, the whole story came out. The mystery was solved, and she knew that John Rokesmith was the true John Harmon, and that her husband was really the man the Harmon will had picked out for her to marry. In the splendid Boffin house they lived happily for many years, surrounded by Bella's children, and they were never so happy as when they welcomed Eugene Wrayburn with Lizzie his wife, or Jenny Wren, the little doll's dressmaker. End of section 50.
Section 51 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by JaySands. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. A Tale of Two Cities. How Lucie Found a Father. A little more than 100 years ago there lived in London, one of the two cities of this tale, a lovely girl of 17 named Lucie Minette. Her mother had died when she was a baby in France, and she lived alone with her old nurse, Miss Pross, a homely, grim guardian with her hair as red as her face, who called Lucie Ladybird and loved her very much. Miss Pross was sharp of speech and was always snapping people up as if she would bite their heads off, but though she seldom chose to show it, she was the kindest, truest, most unselfish person in the world. Lucie had no memory of her father, and had always believed he also had died when she was a baby. One day, however, through a Mr. Lowry, the agent of a bank, she learned a wonderful piece of news. He told her that her father was not dead, but that he had been wickedly thrown into a secret prison in Paris before she was born, and had been lost thus for 18 long years. This prison was the Bastille, a cold, dark building like a castle, with high grey towers, a deep moat and drawbridge, and soldiers and cannon to defend it. In those days in France, the rich nobles who belonged to the royal court were very powerful and overbearing, and the rest of the people had few rights. One could be put into prison then without any trial at all, so that many innocent people suffered. Lucie's mother had guessed that Dr. Minette, for he was a physician, had in some way incurred the hatred of some of the nobles and had thus been taken from her. But all she certainly knew was that he had disappeared one day in Paris and had never come back. For a year she had tried in every way to find him, but at length, desolate and heartbroken, she had fallen ill and died, leaving little Lucie with only Miss Pross, her English nurse, to care for her. Mr. Lowry himself, who told Lucie this story, having known her father, had brought her, a baby, to London in his arms. Now, he told her, after all these years, her father had been released, and was at that moment in Paris in charge of a man named Defarge, who had once been his servant. But the long imprisonment had affected his mind, so that he was little more than the broken wreck of a man he had once been. Mr. Lowry was about to go to Paris to identify him, and he wished Lucie to go along to bring him to himself. You can imagine that Lucie's heart was both glad and sorrowful at the news. Joyful that her father, she had always believed dead, was alive, and yet full of grief for his condition. She hastily made ready, and that same day set out with Mr. Lowry for France. When they reached Paris, they went at once to find Defarge. He was a stern, forbidding man, who kept a cheap wine shop in one of the poorer quarters of the city. He took them through a dirty courtyard behind the shop and up 5 flights of filthy stairs to a door, which he unlocked for them to enter. In the dim room sat a withered, white-haired old man on a low bench, making shoes. His cheeks were worn and hollow, his eyes were bright, and his long beard was as white as snow. He wore a ragged shirt, and his hands were thin and transparent from confinement. It was Lucie's father, Dr. Minette. He scarcely looked up when they entered, for his mind was gone and he knew no one. All that seemed to interest him was his shoemaking. He had forgotten everything else. He even thought his own name was 105, North Tower, which had been the number of his cell in the Bastille. Lucie's heart almost broke to see him. She wanted to throw her arms about him, to lay her head on his breast and tell him she was his daughter who loved him and had to come take him home at last. But she was afraid this would frighten him. She came close to him, and after a while he began to look at her. She greatly resembled her dead mother, and presently her face seemed to remind him of something. He unwound a string from round his neck and unfolded a little rag which was tied to it, and there was a lock of hair like Lucie's. Then he suddenly burst into tears, the first he had shed for long, long years, and the tears seemed to bring back a part of the past. Lucie took him in her arms and soothed him, while Mr. Lorry went to bring the coach that was to take them to England. Through all their preparations for departure, her father sat watching in sort of a scared wonder, holding tight to Lucie's hand like a child. And when they told him to come with them, he descended the stairs obediently. But he would not go into the coach without his bench and shoemaking tools, and, to quiet him, they were obliged to take them too. So the father and daughter and Mr. Lowry journeyed back to Lucie's home in London. All the miles they rode, Lucie held her father's hand, and the touch seemed to give him strength and confidence. On the boat crossing to London was a young man who called himself Charles Darnay, handsome, dark, and pale. He was most kind to Lucie, and showed her how to make a couch on deck for her father, and how she could shelter it from the wind. In the long months that followed their arrival, while the poor old man regained a measure of health, she never forgot Darnay's face and his kindness to them. Dr. Manet's mind and memory came slowly back with his improving health. There were some days when his brain clouded. Then Lucie would find him seated at his old prison bench making shoes, and she would coax him away and talk to him until the insanity would pass away. So time went by peacefully till a strange thing happened. Charles Darnay, who had been so kind to Lucie and her father on the boat, was arrested on a charge of treason. England at the time was not on good terms with France, and Darnay, who was of French birth, was accused of selling information concerning the English forts and army to the French government. This was a very serious charge, for men convicted of treason then were put to death in the cruelest ways that could be invented. The charge was not true, and Darnay himself knew quite well who was working against him. The fact was that Charles Darnay was not his true name. He was really Charles Saint Evremond, the descendant of a rich and noble French family, though he chose to live in London as Charles Darnay, and earned his living by giving lessons in French. He did this because he would not be one of the hated noble class of his own country, who treated the poor so heartlessly. In France, the peasants had to pay many oppressive taxes, and were wretched and half-starved, while the rich nobles rode in gilded coaches, and, if they ran over a little peasant child, threw a coin to its mother and drove on without a further thought. Among the hardest-hearted of all, and the most hated by the common people, were the Evremonds, the family of the young man who was now accused of treason. As soon as he was old enough to know how unjust was his family's treatment of the poor who were dependent on them, he had protested against it. When he became a man, he had refused to live on the money that was thus taken from the hungry peasantry, and had left his home and came to London to earn his own way by teaching. His heartless uncle, the Marquis de Saint-Evremond, in France, the head of the family, hated the young man for his noble spirit. It was this uncle who invented the plot to accuse his nephew of treason. He had hired a dishonest spy known as Barsad, who swore he had found papers in Darnay's trunk that proved his guilt, and, as Darnay had been often back and forth to France on family matters, the case looked dark for him. Cruelly enough, among those who were called to the trial as witnesses, to show that Darnay had made these frequent journeys to France, were Dr. Manette and Lucie, because they had seen him on the boat during that memorable crossing. Lucie's tears fell fast as she gave her testimony, believing him innocent, knowing that her words would be used to condemn him. Darnay would doubtless have been convicted but for a curious coincidence. A dissipated young lawyer, named Sidney Carton, sitting in the courtroom, had noticed with surprise that he himself looked very much like the prisoner. In fact, that they were so much alike they might almost have been taken for twin brothers. He called the attention of Darnay's lawyer to this, and the latter, while one of the witnesses against Darnay was making oath that he had seen him in a certain place in France, made Carton take off his wig — all lawyers wear wigs in England while in court — and stand up beside Darnay. The two were so alike the witness was puzzled, and he could not swear which of the two he had seen. For this reason, Darnay, to Lucie's great joy, was found not guilty. Sidney Carton, who had thought of and suggested this clever thing, was a reckless, besotted young man. He cared for nobody, and nobody, he used to say, cared for him. He lacked energy and ambition to work and struggle for himself, but for the sake of plenty of money with which to buy liquor, he studied cases for another lawyer, who was fast growing rich by his labor. His master, who hired him, was the lion. Carton was content, through his indolence and lack of purpose, to be the jackal. His conscience had always condemned him for this, and now, as he saw the innocent Darnay's look, noble and straightforward, so like himself as he might have been, and as he thought of Lucie's sweet face and of how she had wept as she was forced to give testimony against the other, Carton felt that he almost hated the man whose life he had saved. The trial brought Lucie and these two men, so like each other in feature, yet so unlike in character, together, and afterward they often met at Dr. Manette's house. It was in a quiet part of London that Lucie and her father lived, all alone save for the faithful Miss Pross. They had little furniture, for they were quite poor, but Lucie made the most of everything. Dr. Manette had recovered his mind, but not all of his memory. Sometimes he would get up in the night and walk up and down, for hours. At such times Lucie would hurry to him and walk up and down with him till he was calm again. She never knew why he did this, but she came to believe he was trying vainly to remember all that had happened in those lost years which he had forgotten. He kept his prison bench and tools always by him, but as time went on he gradually used them less and less often. Mr. Lorry, with his flaxen wig and constant smile, came to tea every Sunday with them and helped to keep Dr. Manette cheerful. Sometimes Darnay, Sidney Carton, and Mr. Lorry would meet there together, but of them all, Darnay came oftenest, and soon it was easy to see that he was in love with Lucie. Sidney Carton, too, was in love with her, but he was perfectly aware that he was quite undeserving, and that Lucie could never love him in return. She was the last dream of his wild, careless life, the life he had wasted and thrown away. Once he told her this, and said that, although he could never be anything to her himself, he would give his life gladly to save any one who was near and dear to her. Lucie fell in love with Darnay at length, and one day they were married and went away on their wedding journey. Until then, since his rescue, Lucie had never been out of Dr. Manet's sight. Now, though he was glad for her happiness, yet he felt the pain of the separation so keenly that it unhinged his mind again. Miss Pross and Mr. Lorry found him next morning making shoes at the old prison bench, and for 9 days he did not know them at all. At last, however, he recovered, and then, lest the sight of it affect him, one day when he was not there they chopped the bench to pieces and burned it up. But her father was better after Lucie came back with her husband, and they took up their quiet life again. Darnay loved Lucie devotedly. He supported himself still by teaching. Mr. Lorry came from the bank oftener to tea, and Sidney Carton more rarely, and their life was peaceful and content. Once after his marriage, his cruel uncle, the Marquis de Saint-Evremond, sent for Darnay to come to France on family matters. Darnay went, but declined to remain or to do the other's bidding. But his uncle's evil life was soon to be ended. While Darnay was there, the Marquis was murdered one night in his bed by a grief-crazed laborer, whose little child his carriage had run over. Darnay returned to England, shocked and horrified the more at the indifference of the life led by his race in France, although now, by the death of his uncle, he had himself become the Marquis de Saint-Evremond. Yet he would not lay claim to the title, and left all the estates in charge of one of the house servants, an honest steward named Gabelle. He had intended after his return to Lucie to settle all these affairs, and to dispose of the property, which he felt it wrong for him to hold. But in the peace and happiness of his life in England, he put it off, and did nothing further. And this neglect of Darnay's, as important things neglected are apt to prove, came before long to be the cause of terrible misfortune and agony to them all. End of section 51. Recorded by JaySands. Section 52 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by JaySands. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. A Tale of Two Cities. Darnay caught in the net. While these things were happening in London, the one city of this tale, other very different events were occurring in the city of this story. Paris, the French capital. The indifference and harsh oppression of the court and the nobles toward the poor had gone on increasing day by day, and day by day the latter had grown more sullen and resentful. All the while the downtrodden people of Paris were plotting secretly to rise in rebellion, kill the king and queen and all the nobles, seize their riches and govern France themselves. The center of this plotting was Defarge, the keeper of the wine shop, who had cared for Dr. Manette when he had first been released from the prison. Defarge and those he trusted met and planned often in the very room where Mr. Lorry and Lucie had found her father making shoes. They kept a record of all acts of cruelty toward the poor committed by the nobility, determining that, when they themselves should be strong enough, those thus guilty should be killed, their fine houses burned, and all their descendants put to death, so that not even their names should remain in France. This was a wicked and awful determination, but these poor, wretched people had been made to suffer all their lives, and their parents before them, and centuries of oppression had killed all their pity and made them as fierce as wild beasts that only wait for their cages to be opened to destroy all in their path. They were afraid, of course, to keep any written list of persons whom they had thus condemned, so Madame Defarge, the wife of the wine-seller, used to knit the names in fine stitches into a long piece of knitting that she seemed always at work on. Madame Defarge was a stout woman with big coarse hands and eyes that never seemed to look at anyone, yet saw everything that happened. She was as strong as a man, and everyone was somewhat afraid of her. She was even crueler and more resolute than her husband. She would sit knitting all day long in the dirty wine shop, watching and listening, and knitting in the names of people who she hoped soon to see killed. One of the hated names that she knitted over and over again was Evrémonde, the laborer who, in the madness of his grief for his dead child, had murdered the Marquis de Saint-Evrémonde, Darnay's hard-hearted uncle, and had caught and hanged, and, because of this, Defarge and his wife and the other plotters had condemned all the name of Evrémonde to death. Meanwhile the king and queen of France, and all their gay and careless court of nobles, feasted and danced as heedlessly as ever. They did not see the storm rising. The bitter taxes still went on. The wine shop of Defarge looked as peaceful as ever. But the men who drank there now were dreaming of murder and revenge, and the half-starved woman who sat and looked on as the gilded coaches of the rich rolled through the streets were sullenly waiting, watching Madame Defarge as she silently knitted into her work names of those whom the people had condemned to death without mercy. One day this frightful human storm, which for so many years had been gathering in France, burst over Paris. The poor people rose by thousands, seized whatever weapons they could get, guns, axes, or even stones of the street, and, led by Defarge and his tiggerish wife, set out to avenge their wrongs. Their rage turned first of all against the Bastille, the old stone prison in which so many of their kind had died, where Dr. Manet for 18 years had made shoes. They beat down the thick walls and butchered the soldiers who defended it, and released the prisoners. And wherever they saw one of the king's uniforms, they hanged the wearer to the nearest lamp-post. It was the beginning of the terrible revolution in France that was to end in murder of thousands of innocent lives. It was the beginning of a time when Paris's streets were to run with blood, when all the worst passions of the people were loosed, and when they went mad with the joy of revenge. The storm spread over France, to the village where stood the great chateau of the Erminie family, and the peasants set fire to it and burned it to the ground. And Gabelle, the servant who had been left in charge by Darnay, the new Marquis de Saint-Epermonde, whom they had never seen but yet hated, they seized but put in prison. They stormed the royal palace and arrested the king and queen, threw all who bore noble names or titles into dungeons, and, as they had planned, set up a government of their own. Darnay, safe in London with Lucie, knew little and thought less of all this, till he received a pitiful letter from Gabelle, who expected each morning to be dragged out to be killed, telling of the plight into which his faithfulness had brought him, and beseeching his master's aid. This letter made Darnay most uneasy. He blamed himself because he knew it was his fault that Gabelle had been left so long in such a dangerous post. He did not forget that his own family, the Erminie's, had been greatly hated, but he thought the fact that he himself had refused to be one of them, and had given his sympathy rather to the people they oppressed, would make it possible for him to obtain Gabelle's release. In this idea he determined to go himself to Paris. He knew the very thought of his going, now that France was mad with violence, would frighten Lucie, so he determined not to tell her. He packed some clothing, hurriedly, and left secretly, sending a letter back telling her where and why he was going. And by the time she read this, he was well on his way from England. Darnay had expected to find no trouble in his errand, and little personal risk in his journey, but as soon as he landed on the shores of France, he discovered his mistake. He had only to give his real name, the Marquis de Saint-Epermonde, which he was obliged to do if he would help Gabelle, and the title was the signal for rude threats and ill-treatment. Once in, he could not go back, and he felt as if a monstrous net were closing around him, as indeed it was, from which there was no escape. He was sent on to Paris under a guard of soldiers, and there he was at once put into prison to be tried, and in all probability condemned to death, as one of the hated noble class whom the people were now killing as fast as they could. The great room of the prison to which he was taken, Darnay found full of ladies and gentlemen, most of them rich and titled, the men chatting, the women reading or doing embroidery, all courteous and polite, as if they sat in their own splendid homes, instead of in a prison from which most of them could issue only a dreadful death. He was allowed to remain here only a few moments. Then he was taken to an empty cell and left alone. It happened that the bank of which Mr. Lowry was agent had an office also in Paris, and the old gentleman had come there on business the day before Darnay arrived. Mr. Lowry was an Englishman born, and for him there was no danger. He knew nothing of the arrest of Darnay until a day or two later, when, as he sat in his room, Dr. Manet and Lucie entered, just arrived from London, deeply agitated and in great fear for Darnay's safety. As soon as Lucie had read her husband's letter, she had followed at once with her father and Miss Pross. Dr. Manet, knowing Darnay's real name and title, for before he married Lucie he had told her father everything concerning himself, feared danger for him. But he had reasoned that his own long imprisonment in the Bastille, the building the people had first destroyed, would make him a favorite and render him able to aid Darnay if danger came. On the way, they had heard the sad news of his arrest, and had come at once to Mr. Lowry to consider what might best be done. While they talked, through the window they saw a great crowd of people come rushing into the courtyard of the building to sharpen weapons on a huge grindstone that stood there. They were going to murder the prisoners, with which the jails were by this time full. Fearful that he would be too late to save Darnay, Dr. Manet rushed to the yard, his white hair streaming in the wind, and told the leaders of the mob who he was, how he had been imprisoned for 18 years in the Bastille, and that now one of his kindred, by some unknown error, had been seized. They cheered him, lifted him on their shoulders, and rushed away to demand for him the release of Darnay, while Lucie, in tears, with Mr. Lorry and Miss Pross, waited all night for tidings. But none came that night. The rescue had not proved easy. Next day, Defarge, the wine shopkeeper, brought a short note to Lucie from Darnay to the prison, but it was 4 days before Dr. Manette returned to the house. He had, indeed, by the story of his own sufferings, saved Darnay's life for the time being, but the prisoner, he had been told, could not be released without trial. For this trial they waited day after day. The time passed slowly and terribly. Prisoners were no longer murdered without trial, but few escaped the death penalty. The king and queen were beheaded. Thousands were put to death merely on suspicion, and thousands more were thrown into prison to await their turn. This was that dreadful period which has always since been called the Reign of Terror, when no one felt sure of his safety. There was a certain window in the prison through which Darnay sometimes found a chance to look, and from which he could see one dingy street corner. On this corner, every afternoon, Lucie took her station for hours. Rain or shine, she never missed a day, and thus, at long intervals, her husband got a view of her. So months passed till a year had gone. All the while Dr. Manette, now became a well-known figure in Paris, worked hard for Darnay's release, and at length his turn came to be tried, and he was brought before the drunken, ignorant men who called themselves judge and jury. He told how he had years before renounced his family and title, left France, and supported himself rather than be a burden on the peasantry. He told how he had married a woman of French birth, the only daughter of the good Dr. Manette, whom all Paris knew, and had come to Paris now of his own accord to help a poor servant who was in danger through his fault. The story caught the fancy of the changeable crowd in the room. They cheered and applauded it. When he was acquitted, they were quite as pleased as if he had been condemned to be beheaded, and put him in a great chair and carried him home in triumph to Lucie. There was only one there, perhaps, who did not rejoice at the result, and that was the cold, cruel wife of the wine-seller, Madame Defarge, who had knitted the name Evrémonde so many times into her knitting. End of section 52. Recorded by JaySands. Section 53 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by JaySands. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. Sidney Carton's Sacrifice. That same night of his release, all the happiness of Darnay and Lucie was suddenly broken. Soldiers came and again arrested him. Defarge and his wife were the accusers this time, and he was to be retired. The first one to bring this fresh piece of bad news to Mr. Lorry was Sidney Carton, the reckless and dissipated young lawyer. Probably he had heard in London of Lucie's trouble, and out of his love for her, which he always carried hidden in his heart, had come to Paris to try to aid her husband. He had arrived only to hear at the same time of the acquittal and the rearrest. As Carton walked along the street, thinking sadly of Lucie's new grief, he saw a man whose face and figure seemed familiar. Following, he soon recognized him as the English spy Barsad, whose false testimony, years before in London, had come so near convincing Darnay when he was tried for treason. Barsad, who, as it happened, was now a turnkey in the very prison where Darnay was confined, had left London to become a spy in France, first on the side of the king and then on the side of the people. At the time of this story, England was so hated by France that if the people had known of Bassad's career in London, they would have cut off his head at once. Carton, who was well aware of this, threatened the spy and his knowledge, and made him swear that if worst came to worst and Darnay were condemned, he would admit Carton to the cell to see him once before he was taken to execution. Why Carton asked this, Bassad could not guess, but to save himself he had to promise. Next day Darnay was tried for the second time. When the judge asked for the accusation, Defarge laid a paper before him. It was a letter that had been found when the Bastille fell, in that cell that had been occupied for 18 years by Dr. Manet. He had written it before reason left him, and hidden it behind a loosened stone in the wall, and in it he had told the story of his own unjust arrest. Defarge read it aloud to the jury, and this was the terrible tale it told. The Marquis de Sade Evermond, the cruel uncle of Darnay, when he was a young man, had dreadfully wronged a young peasant woman, who caused her husband's death and killed her brother with his own hand. As the brother lay dying from the sword wound, Dr. Manet, then also a young man, had been called to attend him, and so, by accident, had learned the whole. Horrified at the wicked wrong, he wrote of it in a letter to the Minister of Justice. The Marquis, whom it accused, learned of this, and, to put Dr. Manet out of the way, had him arrested secretly, taken from his wife and baby daughter, and thrown into a secret cell of the Bastille, where he had lived those 18 years, not knowing whether his wife and child lived or died. He waited 10 years for release, and when none came, at last, feeling his mind giving way, he wrote the account, which he concealed in the cell wall, denouncing the family of Evermond and all their descendants. The reading of this paper by Defarge, as may be guessed, aroused all the murderous passions of the people in the courtroom. There was a further reason for Madame Defarge's hatred, for the poor woman who Darnay's uncle had so wronged had been her own sister. In vain old Dr. Manet pleaded. That his own daughter was now Darnay's wife made no difference in their eyes. The jury at once found Darnay guilty and sentenced him to die by the guillotine the next morning. Lucie fainted when the sentence was pronounced. Sidney Carton, who had witnessed the trial, lifted her and bore her to a carriage. When they reached home, he carried her up the stairs and laid her on a couch. Before he went, he bent down and touched her cheek with his lips. And they heard him whisper, "For a life you love." They did not know until the next day what he meant. Carton had, in fact, formed a desperate plan to rescue Lucie's husband, whom he so much resembled in face and figure, even though it meant his own death. He went to Mr. Lorry and made him promise to have ready next morning passports and a coach and swift horses to leave Paris for England with Dr. Manet, Lucie, and himself, telling him that if they delayed longer, Lucie's life and her father's also would be lost. Next, Carton bought a quantity of a drug whose fumes would render a man insensible, and with this in his pocket early next morning, he went to the spy Barsad, and bade him redeem his promise and take him to the cell where Darnay waited for the signal of death. Darnay was seated, writing a last letter to Lucie when Carton entered. Pretending that he wished him to write something that he dictated, Carton stood over him and held the phial of the drug to his face. In a moment the other was unconscious. Then Carton changed clothes with him and called in the spy, directing him to take the unconscious man, who now seemed to be Sidney Carton instead of Charles Darnay, to Mr. Lorry's house. He himself was to take the prisoner's place and suffer the penalty. The plan worked well. Darnay, who would not have allowed this sacrifice if he had known, was carried safely and without discovery past the guards. Mr. Lorry, guessing what had happened when he saw the unconscious figure, took coach at once with him, Dr. Manet, and Lucie, and started for England that very hour. Miss Pross was left to follow them in another carriage. While Miss Pross sat waiting in the empty house, who should come in but the terrible Madame Defarge? The latter had made up her mind, as Carton had suspected, to denounce Lucie also. It was against the law to mourn for anyone who had been condemned as an enemy to France, and the woman was sure, of course, that Lucie would be mourning for her husband, who was to die within the hour. So she stopped on her way to the execution to see Lucie, and thus have evidence against her. When Madame Defarge entered, Miss Pross read the hatred and evil purpose in her face. The grim old nurse knew, if it were known that Lucie had gone, the coach would be pursued and brought back. So she planted herself in front of the door of Lucie's room, and would not let Madame Defarge open it. This savage Frenchwoman tried to tear her away, but Miss Pross seized her around the waist and held her back. The other drew a loaded pistol from her breast to shoot her, but in the struggle it went off and killed Madame Defarge herself. Then Miss Pross, all of a tremble, locked the door, threw the key into the river, took a carriage, and followed after the coach. Not long after the unconscious Darnay, with Lucie and Dr. Manette, passed the gates of Paris, the jailer came to the cell where Sidney Carton sat and called him. It was the summons to die. And with his thoughts on Lucie, whom he had always hopelessly loved, and on her husband, whom he had thus saved to her, he went almost gladly. A poor little seamstress rode in the death-cart beside him. She was so small and weak that she feared to die, and Carton held her cold hand all the way and comforted her to the end. Cruel women of the people sat about the guillotine, knitting and counting with their stitches, as each poor victim died. And when Carton's turn came, thinking he was Darnay, the hated Marquis de Saint-Evremond, they cursed him and laughed. Men said of him about the city that night that it was the peacefullest man's face ever beheld there. If they could have read his thought, if he could have spoken it in words, it would have been these: I see the lives for which I lay down mine, peaceful and happy in that England I shall see no more. I see Lucie and Darnay with a child that bears my name, and I see that I hold a place in their hearts forever. I see her weeping for me on the anniversary of this day. I see the blot I threw upon my name faded away, and I know that till they die neither shall be more honored in the soul of the other than I am honored in the souls of both. It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known. End of section 53. Recording by JaySands.
Section 54 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. Bleak House. The Court of Chancery. An Englishman named Jarndyce, once upon a time having made a great fortune, died and left a great will. The persons appointed to carry out its provisions could not agree. They fell into disputing among themselves and went to law over it. The court which in England decides such suits is called the Court of Chancery. Its action is slow, and it delays many, so that men generally consider it a huge misfortune to be obliged to have anything to do with it. Sometimes it has kept cases undecided for many years, till the heirs concerned were dead and gone, and often when the decision came at last, there was no money left to be divided, because it had all been eaten up by the costs of the suit. Lawyers inherited some cases from their fathers, who themselves had made a living by it, and many suits had become so twisted that nobody alive could have told at last what they really meant. Such came to be with the case of the Jarndyce will. It had been tried for so many years that the very name had become a joke. Those who began it were long since dead, and their heirs either knew nothing of it, or had given up hope of its ever being ended. The only one who seemed to be interested in it was a little old woman named Miss Flite, whom delay and despair in a suit of her own had made half crazy. For many years she had attended the Chancery Court every day, and many thoughtless people made fun of her. She was wretchedly poor and lived in a small room over a rag-and-bottle shop kept by a man named Krook. Here she had a great number of birds in little cages, larks and linnets and goldfinches. She had given them names to represent the different things which the cruel Chancery Court required to carry on these shameful suits, such as hope, youth, rest, ashes, ruin, despair, madness, folly, words, plunder, and jargon. She used to say that when the Jarndyce case was decided, she would open the cages and let all the birds go. The last Jarndyce that was left had given up in disgust all thought of the famous lawsuit and steadfastly refused to have anything to do with it. He lived quietly in the country in a big, bare building called Bleak House. He was past middle age, and his hair was silver grey, but he was straight and strong and merry. He was rich, yet was so tender-hearted and benevolent that all who knew him loved him. Most of his good deeds he never told, for he had a great dislike to being thanked. It used to be said that once after he had done an extremely generous thing for a relative of his, seeing her coming in from the gate to thank him, he escaped by the back door and was not seen again for 3 months. He never spoke ill of his neighbours, and whenever he was vexed he would pretend to look for a weathercock and say, "Dear, dear, the wind must be coming from the east." It happened finally that all the other Jarndyce heirs had died except 2, a young girl named Ada Clare and a young man named Richard Carston. These 2, who were cousins, were left orphans. The master of Bleak House, therefore, in the goodness of his heart, offered them a house with him, and this they thankfully accepted. Mr. Jarndyce now wished to find a companion for Ada Clare, and this is how Esther Summerson comes into this story. Esther was a sweet girl who had been brought up by a stern, hard-hearted woman, who she had always called godmother, in ignorance of her parentage. She had never known who were her mother or father, for from the earliest babyhood her godmother had forbidden her to ask questions concerning them, and she would have had a sad and lonely youth but for her sunny disposition. It was not till her godmother died that she suddenly found she had a guardian, and that he was Mr. Jarndyce of Bleak House. How he came to be her guardian was a mystery to her, but she was glad to find herself not altogether friendless. Although he had taken pains to see her more than once, and had noticed with pleasure what a cheerful, loving nature she had, yet Esther had never, as far as she knew, seen him, so that she received his invitation to come and live at Bleak House with joyful surprise. She went, on the day appointed, to London, and there she met Ada, whom she began to love at once, and Richard, a handsome, careless young fellow of 19. They spent the day together and got well acquainted before they took the morrow's coach to Bleak House. At the Chancery Court they met poor crazy little Miss Flite, who insisted on taking them to her room above the rag-and-bottle shop to show them her caged birds. And that night, as they had been directed, they stayed at the house of a Mrs. Jellyby, of whom Mr. Jarndyce had heard as a woman of great charity. Mrs. Jellyby was a woman with a mission, which mission was the education of the natives of Borrioboola in Africa, and the cultivation there of the coffee bean. She thought of nothing else, and was forever sending out letters or pamphlets about it. But she seemed unable to see or think of anything nearer home than Africa. The house was unswept, the children dirty and always underfoot, and the meals half-cooked. She would sit all day in slipshod slippers, and a dress that did not meet in the back, drinking coffee and dictating to her eldest daughter, Caddy, who hated Africa and all its natives, letters about coffee cultivation and the uplifting of the natives of Borrioboola. A very strange sort of philanthropist, both Esther and Ada thought, Mrs. Jellyby. Perhaps, however, Mr. Jarndyce sent them there for a useful lesson, for he afterward asked them what they thought of her, and he seemed well pleased to learn that they considered her ideas of doing good in the world extremely odd. Next day they drove to Bleak House. Not one of them had ever seen Mr. Jarndyce, but they found him all they had imagined and more, the kindest, pleasantest, and most thoughtful person in the world. Before they had been there 2 days, they felt as if they had known him all their lives. Bleak House was a building where one went up and down steps from one room to another, and where there were always more rooms when one thought one had seen them all. In the daytime there was horseback riding or walking to amuse them, and in the evenings Ada often sang and played to the rest. Altogether the time flew by most pleasantly, and judging by Mr. Jarndyce's jollity, the wind seldom showed any signs of coming from the east. It was soon clear to everybody that Richard was in love with Ada, and that Ada was beginning to love him in return. This pleased Mr. Jarndyce, for he was fond of them both. But he was fondest of Esther. He made her his housekeeper, and she carried a big bunch of keys and kept the house as clean as a new pin. He used to say that she reminded him of little old woman and wither so high, to sweep the cobwebs out of the sky. She was so cheerful, he said, she would sweep the cobwebs out of anybody's sky. And from this they took to calling her little old woman and cobweb and Mother Hubbard, till none of them thought of her real name at all. Bleak House had a number of visitors who came more or less often. One of these was an old school friend of Mr. Jarndyce's named Boythorn. He was a big, blustering man with a laugh as big as himself. Wherever he went he carried a tiny, tame canary that used to sit at mealtime perched on top of his great shaggy head. It was odd to see this wee bird sitting there unafraid, even at one of his ha-ha-ha's that shook the whole house. Mr. Boythorn was exceedingly tender-hearted, but took delight in pretending to be the stubbornest, most cross-grained, worst-tempered individual possible. His neighbour was Sir Leicester Dedlock, a dignified and proud old baronet, and him Mr. Boythorn loved to keep in perpetual anger by bringing against him all manner of lawsuits regarding the boundary between their lands. Another visitor whom Esther found amusing was Harold Skimpole, a light, bright creature of charming manners, with a large head and full of simple gaiety. He was a man who seemed to trifle with everything. He sang a little, composed a little, and sketched a little, but his songs were never completed, and his sketches were never finished. His aim in life seemed to be to avoid all responsibility, and to find someone else to pay his debts. He always spoke of himself as a child, though he was middle-aged. He claimed to have no idea whatever of the value of money. He would take a handful of coins from his pocket and say, laughing, "Now, there's some money. I have no idea how much. I don't know how to count it. I dare say I owe more than that. If good-natured people don't stop letting me owe them, why should I? There you have Harold Skimpole." Mr. Jarndyce was far too honest and innocent himself to see through the man's hollow selfishness, and was continually paying off his debts, as they soon learned. Most of all Bleak House's visitors, Esther came to like Alan Woodcourt, a handsome, dark-haired young surgeon, and before long she found herself unconsciously looking and longing for his coming. Woodcourt was poor, however, and although he was in love with Esther, he did not tell her, but soon sailed away on a long voyage as a ship's doctor. End of section 54. Section 55 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. Bleak House, Lady Dedlock's Secret. Sir Leicester Dedlock, whom Mr. Boythorn loved to torment, was 70 years old. His wife, many years younger than himself, he had married for love. Lady Dedlock was not noble by birth. No one, indeed, knew who she had been before her marriage, but she was very beautiful. She was as proud and haughty, too, as she was lovely, and was much sought after. But with all her popularity, she had few close friends, and none in whom she confided. Even her housekeeper, Mrs. Rouncewell, a fine, handsome old woman who had been Sir Leicester's servant for 50 years, thought her cold and reserved. Mrs. Rouncewell herself had had a son, George, who many years before had gone off to be a soldier and had never come back, and looking at her mistress's face, She often wondered if the shadow of pain there was the mark of some old grief or loss which no one knew. However that may have been, the old baronet loved his wife, and was very proud of her. Sir Leicester's family lawyer was named Tulkinghorn. He was a dull, dignified man, who always dressed in black and seldom spoke unless he had to. His one passion was the discovery of other people's secrets. He knew more family secrets than anyone else in London, and to discover a new one he would have risked all his fortune. Now, among the very many people connected in some way or other with the famous Jarndyce case, which seemed destined never to end, was Sir Leicester Dedlock. And one day, the Chancery Court having actually made a little progress, Mr. Tulkinghorn brought the baronet some legal papers to read to him. As the lawyer held one in his hand, Lady Dedlock, seeing the handwriting, asked in an agitated voice who had written it. He answered that it was the work of one of his copyists. A moment later, as he went on reading, they found that Lady Dedlock had fainted away. Her husband did not connect her faintness with the paper, but Mr. Tulkinghorn did, and that instant he determined that Lady Dedlock had a secret, and that this secret had something to do with the copyist, and that what this secret was, he, Tulkinghorn, would discover. He easily found that the writing had been done by a man who called himself Nemo, and who lived above Crook's rag and bottle shop, a neighbour to crazy little Miss Flite of the Chancery Court and the many bird cages. Crook himself was an ignorant, spectacled old rascal, whose sole occupation seemed to be to sleep and to drink gin, a bottle of which always stood near him. His only intimate was a big, grey, evil-tempered cat called Lady Jane, who, when it was not lying in wait for Miss Flite's birds, used to sit on his shoulder with her tail sticking straight up like a hairy feather. People in the neighbourhood called his dirty shop the Court of Chancery, because, like that other court, it had so many old things in it, and whatever its owner once got into it never got out again. In return for Tulkinghorn's money, Crook told him all he knew about his lodger. Nemo, it seemed, was surly and dissipated, and did what legal copying he could get to do in order to buy opium, with which he drugged himself daily. So far as was known, he had but one friend, Joe, a wretched crossing-sweeper, to whom, when he had it, he often gave a coin. Thus much the lawyer learned, but from the strange lodger himself he learned nothing, for when Crook took him to the room Nemo occupied, they found the latter stretched on his couch, dead, whether by accident or design no one could tell, of an overdose of opium. Curious to see how Lady Dedlock would receive this news, Mr. Tulkinghorn called on her and told her of the unknown man's death. She pretended to listen with little interest, but his trained eye saw that she was deeply moved by it, and he became more anxious than ever to find out what connection there could be between this proud and titled woman and the miserable copyist who had lived and died in squalor. Chance favoured Mr. Tulkinghorn's object. One night he saw Joe, the ragged crossing-sweeper, pointing out to a woman whose face was hidden by a veil, and whose form was closely wrapped in a French shawl, the gate of the cemetery where Nemo had been buried. Later, at Sir Leicester's, he saw Lady Dedlock's maid, Hortense, a black-haired, jealous Frenchwoman, with wolf-like ways, wearing the same shawl. He cunningly entrapped the maid into coming to his house one night wearing both veil and shawl, and there brought her unexpectedly face to face with Joe. By the boy's actions, Mr. Tulkinghorn decided at once that Joe had never seen Hortense before, and that instant he guessed the truth, that the veiled woman who had gone to the cemetery was really Lady Dedlock herself, and that she had worn her maid's clothes to mislead any observer. This was a clever trick in the lawyer, but it proved too clever for his own good, for, finding she had been enticed there for some deeper purpose, Hortense flew into a passion with him. He sneered at her and turned her out into the street, threatening, if she troubled him, to have her put in prison. Because of this she began to hate him with a fierceness which he did not guess. Mr. Tulkinghorn found himself getting nearer his goal, but he now had to find out who Nemo really was. If he had only known it, Crook could have aided him. The old man had found a bundle of old letters in Nemo's room after his death, and these were all addressed to Captain Hawdon. Krook himself could not read, except enough to spell out an address, and he had no idea what the letters contained. But he was quick to think the bundle might be worth some money, so he put it carefully away. But Mr. Tulkinghorn found out nothing from Krook, for one day a strange thing happened. Krook had drunk so much gin in his life that he had become perfectly soaked with alcohol, so that he was just like a big spongeful of it. Now, it is a curious fact that when a great mass of inflammable material is heaped together, sometimes it will suddenly burst into flame and burn up all in a minute, without anything or anybody setting fire to it. This is just what happened to Krook. As he stood in the middle of the dirty shop without any warning, all in a twinkling, he blazed up and burned, clothes and all, and in less time than it takes to tell it, there was nothing left but a little pile of ashes, a burn mark on the floor, and a sticky smoke that stuck to the window panes and hung in the air like soot. And this was all the neighbours found when they came to search for him. This was the end of Krook, and the rag and bottle shop was taken possession of by Grandfather Smallweed, a hideous crippled money-lender, who had been his brother-in-law, and who at once went to work ransacking all the papers he could find on the premises. Grandfather Smallweed was a thin, toothless, wheezy, green-eyed old miser, who was so nearly dead from age and asthma that he had to be wheeled about by his granddaughter Judy. He had a wife who was out of her mind. Everything said in her hearing she connected with the idea of money. If one said, for example, "It's 20 minutes past soon," Mrs. Smallweed would at once begin to gabble, 20 pence, 20 pounds, 20,000 millions of banknotes locked up in a black box, and she would not stop till her husband threw a cushion at her, which he kept beside him for that very purpose, and knocked her mouth shut. Grandfather Smallweed soon discovered the bundle of letters hidden in back of the shelf where Lady Jane, Krook's big cat, slept. The name they bore, Captain Hawdon, was familiar enough to the moneylender. Long ago, when Hawdon was living a dissipated life in London, he had borrowed money from Grandfather Smallweed, and this money was still unpaid when he had disappeared. It was said that he had fallen overboard from a vessel and had been drowned. To think now that the captain had been living as a copyist all these years in London, free from arrest for the debt, filled the wizened soul of that old man with rage. He was ready enough to talk when Mr. Tulkinghorn questioned him, and finally sold him the bundle of letters. The lawyer saw that they were in Lady Dedlock's penmanship. It remained to prove that the dead Nemo had really been Captain Hawdon. Mr. Tulkinghorn, of course, had many specimens of the copyist's hand, and after much search he found a man who had once been a fellow soldier of the captain's. He was called Mr. George, and kept a shooting gallery. Mr. George had among his papers a letter once written him by Captain Hawdon, and not knowing the purpose for which it was to be used, loaned it to the lawyer. The handwriting was the same, and thus Mr. Tulkinghorn knew that the copyist had really been Captain Hawdon, and that the letters in the bundle had once been written to him by the woman who was now the haughty Lady Dedlock. It was a strange, sad story that the letters disclosed, as Mr. Tulkinghorn, gloating over his success, read them, line by line. The man who had fallen so low as to drag out a wretched existence by copying law papers, whom, until she saw the handwriting in the lawyer's hands, she had believed to be dead, was a man Lady Dedlock had once loved. Many years before, when a young woman, she had run away from home with him. A little child was born to them whom she named Esther. When she and Hawdon had separated, her sister, to hide from the world the knowledge of the elopement, had told her the baby Esther was dead, had taken the child to another part of the country, given her the name of Summerson, and calling herself her godmother instead of her aunt, brought her up in ignorance of the truth. Years had gone by, and Captain Hawdon was reported drowned. At length the little Esther's mother had met and married Sir Leicester Dedlock, and in his love and protection had thought her dark past buried from view forever. All this the pitiless lawyer read in the letters, and knew that Lady Dedlock's happiness was now in his hands. As he thought how, with this knowledge, he could torture her with the fear of discovery, his face took on the look of a cat when it plays with a mouse it has caught. Meanwhile, Lady Dedlock had suffered much. The knowledge that Harmon had not been drowned as she had supposed had come to her like a thunderclap, and the news of his death, following so soon after this discovery, had unnerved her. She felt Mr. Tulkinghorn's suspicious eyes watching her always, and began to tremble in dread of what he might know. In the midst of these fears, she accidentally discovered one day that the baby name of Esther Summerson of Bleak House had been not Summerson, but Harmon. This made Lady Dedlock guess the whole truth, that Esther was in reality her own daughter. As soon as she was alone, she threw herself on her knees in the empty room with sobs, crying, "Oh, my child, not dead in the first hours of her life, as my cruel sister told me, but sternly nurtured by her, after she had renounced me and my name. Oh, my child, my child." End of section 55. Section 56 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. Bleak House. Little Joe plays a part. While these events which so closely concerned Esther were occurring in London, life at Bleak House went quietly on. Ada and Esther had become bosom friends, and both loved and respected Mr. Jarndyce above everyone. Harold Skimpole, as charming and careless as ever, and as willing as ever that someone else should pay his debts for him, was often there, and whenever they went to the city they saw Miss Flite and Mrs. Jellyby, the latter still busily sending letters about the growing of coffee and the education of the natives of Borrioboola. Esther grew especially to like Caddy, the Lipshaw daughter to whom Mrs. Jellyby dictated her letters. The poor girl had much good in her, and Esther encouraged and helped her all she could. Caddy finally fell in love with Prince Turveydrop, a blue-eyed, flaxen-haired young man whose father kept a dancing school. Old Mr. Turveydrop, his father, was a fat man with a false complexion, false teeth, false whiskers, a wig, and a padded chest. He always carried a cane, eyeglass, and snuff-box, and was so tightly buttoned up that when he bowed you could almost see creases come to the whites of his eyes. He thought himself a model of politeness, and stood about to show off his clothes while he made his son, Prince, do all the teaching. Caddy was so tired of hearing about Africa that at last she married Prince and moved into the Turveydrop dancing school, and Mrs. Jellyby had to hire a boy to help her with her great plans for the education of the natives of Borrioboola. Once Esther and Ada went with Mr. Jarndyce to visit Mr. Boythorn, the man with the tremendous laugh and the pet canary, at his country house where he lived in one perpetual quarrel with his neighbour, Sir Leicester Dedlock. Esther had often heard of the beauty of Lady Dedlock, and one Sunday in the village church she saw her. There was something strangely familiar in her look that reminded Esther of her godmother. An odd sensation came over her then, and she felt her heart beat quickly. But this was before Lady Dedlock had guessed the truth, and she and Esther did not meet. Richard Carton had soon become to be a source of great anxiety to all at Bleak House. It was plainly to be seen that he loved Ada dearly, and that she loved him as well, but to Mr. Jarndyce's regret he had begun to think and dream of the famous Chancery suit, and of the fortune that would be his when it ended. Mr. Jarndyce, from his own bitter experience, hated the Chancery Court, and everything connected with it, and saw with grief that Richard was growing to be a ne'er-do-well, who found it easier to trust in the future than to labour in the present. In spite of all advice, Richard went from bad to worse. He began the study of medicine, soon changed this for the law, and lastly decided to enter the army. He was naturally a spendthrift, and as long as his money lasted, Harold Skimpole found him a very fine friend and helped him to spend it. Skimpole also introduced him to a knavish lawyer named Vholes, who made him believe the great Chancery suit might soon end in his favour, and who, when Richard put the case in his hands, proceeded to rob him of all he had. He poisoned his mind, too, against Mr. Jarndyce, so that Richard began to think his truest friend deceitful. Ada saw this with pain, But she loved Richard above all else, and the more so when she saw him so wretched and deceived, and at last, without telling either Mr. Jarndyce or Esther what she was going to do, she went to Richard one day and married him, so that as her husband he could take the little fortune she possessed to pay Vholes to go on with the Chancery suit. A great misfortune befell Esther about this time, a misfortune that came to her, strangely enough, through little Joe, the crossing sweeper. Half-starved, ragged, and homeless all his life, Joe had never known kindness save that given to him by the poor copyist who lived above Crook's rag and bottle shop. He lived, if having a corner to sleep in can be called living, in a filthy alley called Tom All Alone's. It seemed to him that everyone he met told him to move on. The policemen, the shopkeepers at whose doors he stopped for warmth, all told him to move on, till the wretched lad wondered if there was any spot in London where he could rest undisturbed. Mr. Tulkinghorn, in his search to find out the woman who had hired Joe to show her the cemetery, had dogged him so with his detective that at length the lad had become frightened and left London for the open country. There he was taken very ill, and on the highway near Bleak House one evening Esther found him helpless and delirious with fever. Touched by his condition, she had him taken at once to Bleak House and put to bed, intending when morning came to send for a doctor. But in the morning little Joe was missing. Though they searched high and low, he was not to be found, and they decided that in his delirium he had taken to the road again. It was not till long after that Esther found his leaving had been brought about by Harold Skimpole, who was then visiting Bleak House, and who in his selfishness feared the boy might be the bearer of some contagious disease. This unfortunately proved to be the case. Joe's illness was smallpox, and a few days later a maid of Esther's fell ill with it. Esther nursed her day and night, and just as she was recovering, was stricken with it herself. In her unselfishness and love for the rest, before unconsciousness came, she made the maid promise faithfully to allow no one, particularly neither Mr. Jarndyce nor her beloved Ada, to enter the room until all danger was past. For many days Esther hovered between life and death, and all the time the maid kept her word. Caddy came from the Turveydrop dancing school early and late, and little Miss Flite walked the 20 miles from London in thin shoes to inquire for her. And at length, slowly, she began to grow well again. But the disease had left its terrible mark. When she first looked in a mirror, she found that all her beauty was gone, and her face strangely altered. This was a great grief to her at first, but on the day when Mr. Jarndyce came into her sick room and held her in his arms and said, "My dear, dear girl," she thought, "He has seen me, and is fonder of me than before, so what have I to mourn for?" She thought of Alan Woodcourt, too, the young surgeon somewhere on the sea, and she was glad that if he had loved her before he sailed away, he had not told her so. Now, she told herself, when they met again and he saw her so sadly changed, he would have given her no promise he need regret. When she was able to travel, Esther went for a short stay at the house of Mr. Boythorn, and there, walking under the trees, she grew stronger. One day, as she sat in the park that surrounded the house, she saw Lady Dedlock coming toward her, and seeing how pale and agitated she was, Esther felt the same odd sensation she had felt in the church. Lady Dedlock threw herself sobbing at her feet, and put her arms around her and kissed her, and told her that she was her unhappy mother, who must keep her secret for the sake of her husband, Sir Leicester. Esther thought her heart must break with both grief and joy at once, but she comforted Lady Dedlock, and told her nothing would ever change her love for her, and they parted with tears and kisses. Another surprise, of a different sort, awaited Esther on her return from Bleak House. Mr. Jarndyce told her he loved her, and asked her if she would marry him. And remembering how tender he had always been, and knowing that he loved her in spite of her disfigured face, she said yes. But one day, the very day he returned, Esther saw Alan Woodcourt on the street. Somehow, at the first glimpse of him, she knew she had loved him all along. Then she remembered that she had promised to marry Mr. Jarndyce, and she began to tremble and ran away without speaking to Woodcourt at all. But they soon met, and this time it was Joe the crossing sweeper who brought them together. Woodcourt found the poor ragged wanderer in the street, so ill he could hardly walk. He had recovered from smallpox, but it had left him so weak, and he had become a prey to consumption. The kind-hearted surgeon took the boy to little Miss Flite, and they found him a place to stay in Mr. George's shooting gallery, where they did what they could for him, and where Esther and Mr. Jarndyce came to see him. Joe was greatly troubled when he learned he had brought the smallpox to Bleak House, and one day he got someone to write out for him in very large letters that he was sorry, and hoped Esther and the others would forgive him. And this was his will. On the last day Alan Woodcourt sat beside him. "Joe, my poor fellow," he said, "I hear you, sir, but it's dark. Let me catch your hand. Joe, can you say what I say?" "I'll say anything as you do, sir, for I know it's good." "Our Father." "Our Father, yes, that's very good, sir." "Which art in heaven." "Art in heaven. Is the light a-coming, sir?" "Hallowed be thy name." "Hallowed be thy—" But the light had come at last. Little Joe was dead. End of section 56. Section 57 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. Bleak House. Esther becomes the mistress of Bleak House. When the last bit of proof was fast in his possession, Mr. Tulkinghorn, pluming himself on the cleverness with which he had wormed his way into Lady Dedlock's secret, went to her at her London home and informed her of all he had discovered, delighting in the fear and dread which she could not help showing. She knew now that this cruel man would always hold his knowledge over her head, torturing her with the threat of making it known to her husband. Some hours after he had gone home, she followed him there to beg him not to tell her husband what he had discovered. But all was dark in the lawyer's house. She rang the private bell twice, but there was no answer, and she returned in despair. By a coincidence, someone else had been seen to call at Mr. Tulkinghorn's that same night. This was Mr. George of the shooting gallery, who came to get back the letter he had loaned to the lawyer. When morning came, it was found that a dreadful deed had been done that night. Mr. Tulkinghorn was found lying dead on the floor of his private apartment, shot through the heart. All the secrets he had so cunningly discovered and gloated over with such delight had not been able to save his life there in that room. Mr. Tulkinghorn was so well known that the murder made a great sensation. The police went at once to the shooting gallery to arrest Mr. George, and he was put into jail. He was later able to prove his innocence, however, and all in all, his arrest turned out to be a fortunate thing. For by means of it, old Mrs. Rouncewell, Lady Dedlock's housekeeper, discovered that he was her own son, George, who had gone off to be a soldier so many years before. He had made up his mind not to return till he was prospering. But somehow the time had never come. Bad fortune had followed him, and he had been ashamed to go back. But though he had acted so wrongly, he had never lost his love for his mother, and was glad to give up the shooting gallery and go with Mrs. Rouncewell to become Sir Leicester's personal attendant. At first, after the death of Mr. Tulkinghorn, Lady Dedlock had hoped her dread and fear were now ended, but she soon found that this was not to be. The telltale bundle of letters was in the possession of a detective whom the cruel lawyer had long ago called to his aid, and the detective, thinking Lady Dedlock herself might have something to do with the murder, thought it his duty to tell all that his dead employer had discovered to Sir Leicester. It was a fearful shock to the haughty baronet to find so many tongues had been busy with the name his wife had borne so proudly. When the detective finished, Sir Leicester fell unconscious, and when he came to his senses, had lost the power to speak. They lay him on his bed, sent for doctors, and went to tell Lady Dedlock, but she had disappeared. Almost at one and the same moment, the unhappy woman had learned not only that the detective had told his story to Sir Leicester, but that she herself was suspected of the murder. These two blows were more than she could bear. She put on a cloak and veil, and leaving all her money and jewels behind her, with a note for her husband, went out into the shrill, frosty wind. The note read, "If I am sought for, or accused of his murder, believe I am wholly innocent. I have no home left. I will trouble you no more. May you forget me, and forgive me." They gave Sir Leicester this note, and great agony came into the stricken man's heart. He had always loved and honoured her, and he loved her no less now for what had been told him. Nor did he believe for a moment that she could be guilty of the murder. He wrote on a slate the words, "Forgive, find," and the detective started at once to overtake the fleeing woman. He went first to Esther, to whom he had told the sad outcome, and together they began the search. For 2 days they laboured, tracing Lady Dedlock's movements step by step, through the pelting snow and wind, across the frozen wastes outside of London, where brick kilns burned, and where she had exchanged clothes with a poor labouring woman, the better to elude pursuit. Then back to London again, where at last they found her. But it was too late. She was lying frozen in the snow at the gate of the cemetery where Captain Hawdon, the copyist whom she had once loved, lay buried. So Lady Dedlock's secret was hidden at last by death. Only the detective, whose business was silence, Sir Leicester, her husband, and Esther, her daughter, knew what her misery had been, or the strange circumstances of her flight, for the police soon succeeded in tracing the murder of Mr. Tulkinghorn to Hortense, the revengeful French maid whom he had threatened to put in prison. One other shadow fell on Esther's life before the clouds cleared away forever. Grandfather Smallweed, rummaging among the papers in Crook's shop, found an old will, and this proved to be the last will made by the original Jarndyce, whose affairs the Court of Chancery had been all these years trying to settle. This will bequeathed the greater part of the fortune to Richard Carston, and its discovery, of course, would have put a stop to the famous suit. But the suit stopped of its own accord, for it was found that there was no longer any fortune left to go to law about or to be willed to anybody. All the money had been eaten up by the costs. After all the years of hope and strain, this disappointment was too much for Richard, and he died that night, at the very hour when poor crazed little Miss Flite, as she had said she would do when the famous suit ended, gave all her caged birds their liberty. The time came at length, after the widowed Ada and her baby boy had come to make their home with Mr. Jarndyce, when Esther felt that she should fulfil her promise and become the mistress of Bleak House. So she told her guardian she was ready to marry him when he wished. He appointed a day, and she began to prepare her wedding clothes. But Mr. Jarndyce, true-hearted and generous as he had always been, had an idea very different from this in his mind. He had found, on Alan Woodcourt's return from his voyage, that the young surgeon still loved Esther. His keen eye had seen that she loved him in return, and he well knew that if she married him, Jarndyce, it would be because of her promise, and because her grateful heart could not find it possible to refuse him. So, wishing most of all for her happiness, he determined to give up his own love for her sake. He bought a house in the town in which Woodcourt had decided to practice medicine, remodelled it, and named it Bleak House after his own. When it was finished in the way he knew Esther liked best, he took her to see it, telling her it was to be a present from him to the surgeon to repay him for his kindness to little Jo. Then, when she had seen it all, he told her that he had guessed her love for Woodcourt, and that though she married the surgeon and not himself, she would still be carrying out her promise, and would still become the mistress of Bleak House. When she lifted her tearful face from his shoulder, she saw that Woodcourt was standing near them. "This is Bleak House," said Jarndyce. "This day I give this house to its little mistress, and before God it is the brightest day of my life." End of section 57.
Section number 58 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julia Wells. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. Hard Times. Mr. Gradgrind and His System. In a cheerless house called Stone Lodge in Coketown, a factory town in England, where great weaving mills made the sky a blur of soot and smoke, lived a man named Gradgrind. He was an obstinate, stubborn man, with a square wall of a forehead and a thin, wide, set mouth. His head was bald and shining, covered with knobs like the crust of a plum pie, and skirted with bristling hair. He had grown rich in the hardware business, and was a school director of the town. He believed in nothing but facts. Everything in the world to him was only good to weigh and measure, and wherever he went, one would have thought he carried in his pocket a rule and scales and the multiplication table. He seemed a kind of human cannon loaded to the muzzle with facts. "Now, what I want is facts," he used to say to Mr. Machoakumchild, the schoolmaster. "Teach boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. Nothing else is of any service to anyone. Stick to facts, sir." He had several children whom he had brought up according to this system of his, and they led wretched lives. No little Gradgrind child had ever seen a face in the moon, or learnt Mother Goose, or listened to fairy stories, or read the Arabian Nights. They all hated Coketown, always rattling and throbbing with machinery. They hated its houses, all built of brick as red as an Indian's face, and the black canal and river purple with dyes. And most of all they hated facts. Louisa, the eldest daughter, looked jaded, for her imagination was quite starved under their teachings. Tom, her youngest brother, was defiant and sullen. "I wish," he used to say, "that I could collect all the facts and all the figures in the world, and all the people who found them out, and I wish I could put 1,000 pounds of gunpowder under them, and blow them all up together." Louisa was very generous, and the only love she knew was for her selfish, worthless brother, who repaid her with very little affection. Of their mother they saw very little. She was a thin, white, pink-eyed bundle of shawls, feeble and ailing, and had too little mind to oppose her husband in anything. Strangely enough, Mr. Gradgrind had a tender heart, and down beneath the facts of his system he had it still, though it had been covered up so long that nobody would have guessed it, least of all, perhaps, his own children. Mr. Gradgrind's intimate friend, one whom he was foolish enough to admire, was Josiah Bounderby, a big, loud, staring man with a puffed head whose skin was stretched so tight it seemed to hold his eyes open. He owned the Coketown mills and a bank besides, and was very rich and pompous. Bounderby was a precious hypocrite, of an odd sort. His greatest pride was to talk continually of his former poverty and wretchedness, and he delighted to tell everybody that he had been born in a ditch, deserted by his wicked mother, and brought up a vagabond by a drunken grandmother, from which low state he had made himself wealthy and respected by his own unaided efforts. Now, this was not the least true. As a matter of fact, his grandmother had been a respectable, honest soul, and his mother had pinched and saved to bring him up decently, had given him some schooling, and finally apprenticed him in a good trade. But Bounderby was so ungrateful, and so anxious to have people think that he himself deserved all the credit, that after he became rich he forbade his mother to tell anyone who she was, and made her live in a little shop in the country 40 miles from Coketown. But in her good and simple heart the old woman was so proud of her son that she used to spend all her little savings to come into town, sometimes walking a good part of the way, cleanly and plainly dressed, and with her spare shawl and umbrella, just to watch him go into his fine house, or to look in admiration at the mills or the fine bank he owned. On such occasions she called herself Mrs. Pegler, and thought no one else would be the wiser. The house in which Bounderby lived had no ornaments. It was cold and lonely and rich. He made his mill hands more than earn their wages, and when any of them complained, he sneered that they wanted to be fed on turtle soup and venison with a golden spoon. Bounderby had for housekeeper a Mrs. Sparsit, who talked a good deal about her genteel birth, rich relations, and of the better days she had once seen. She was a busybody, and when she sat of an evening cutting out embroidery with sharp scissors, her bushy eyebrows and her Roman nose made her look like a hawk, picking out the eyes of a very tough little bird. In her own mind she had set her cap at Bounderby. So firmly had Mr. Gradgrind put his trust in the gospel of facts which he had taught Louisa and Tom that he was greatly shocked one day to catch them, instead of studying any one of the dry sciences ending in ology which he made them learn, peeping through the knot-holes of a wooden pavilion along the road at the performance of a travelling circus. The circus, which was run by a man named Sleary, had settled itself in the neighbourhood for some time to come, and all the performers meanwhile boarded themselves in a nearby public house, the Pegasus's Arms. The show was given every day, and at the moment of Mr. Gradgrind's appearance one Seigneur Jupe, the clown, was showing the tricks of his trained dog Merrylegs, and entertaining the audience with his choicest jokes. Mr. Gradgrind, dumb with amazement, seized both Louisa and Tom and led them home, repeating at intervals with indignation, "What would Mr. Bounderby say?" The question was soon answered, for the latter was at Stone Lodge when they arrived. He reminded Mr. Gradgrind that there was an evil influence in the school the children attended, which no doubt had led them to such idle pursuits, this evil influence being the little daughter of Jupe, the circus clown, and Bounderby advised Mr. Gradgrind to have the child put out of school at once. The name of the clown's little daughter was Cecilia, but everyone called her Sissy. She was a dark-eyed, dark-haired, appealing child, frowned upon by Mr. Machoakumchild, the schoolmaster, because somehow many figures would not stay in her head at one time. When the circus first came, her father, who loved her very much, had brought her to the Gradgrind house and begged that she be allowed to attend school. Mr. Gradgrind had consented. Now, however, at Bounderby's advice, he wished that he had not done so, and started off with the other to the Pegasus's Arms to find Seigneur Jupe, and deny to little Sissy the right of any more schooling. Poor Jupe had been in great trouble that day. For a long time he had felt he was growing too old for the circus business. His joints were getting stiff, and he missed in his tumbling, and he could no longer make the people laugh as he had once done. He knew that before long Sleary would be obliged to discharge him, and he thought that he could not bear to have Sissy see. He had therefore made up his mind to leave the company and disappear. He was too poor to take Sissy with him, so, loving her as he did, he decided to leave her there, where at least she had some friends. He had come to this melancholy conclusion this very day, and had sent Sissy out on an errand so that he might slip away, accompanied only by his dog, Merrylegs, while she was absent. Sissy was returning when she met Mr. Gradgrind and Bounderby, and came with them to find her father. But at the public house she met only sympathizing looks, for all the performers had guessed what her father had done. They told her as gently as they could, but poor Sissy was at first broken-hearted in her grief, and was comforted only by the assurance that her father would certainly come back to her before long. While Sissy wept, Mr. Gradgrind had been pondering. He saw here an excellent chance to put his system to the test. To take this untaught girl and bring her up from the start entirely on facts would be a good experiment. With this in view, then, he proposed to take Sissy to his house and to care for and teach her, provided that she promised to have nothing further to do with the circus or its members. Sissy knew how anxious her father had been to have her learn, so she agreed, and was taken at once to Stone Lodge, and set to work upon facts. But alas! Mr. Gradgrind's education seemed to make Sissy low-spirited, but no wiser. Every day she watched and longed for some message from her father, but none came. She was loving and lovable, and Louisa liked her and comforted her as well as she could, but Louisa was far too unhappy herself to be of any use to anyone else. Several years went by. Sissy's father had never returned. She had grown into a quiet, lovely girl, the only ray of light in that gloomy home. Mr. Gradgrind had realised one of his ambitions, had been elected to Parliament, and now spent much time in London. Mrs. Gradgrind was yet feebler and more ailing. Tom had grown to be a young man, a selfish and idle one, and Bounderby had made him a clerk in his bank. Louisa, not blind to her brother's faults, but loving him devotedly, had become, in this time, an especial object of Bounderby's notice. Indeed, the mill owner had determined to marry her. Louisa had always been repelled by his coarseness and rough ways, and when he had proposed for her hand, she shrank from the thought. If her father had ever encouraged her confidence, she might have thrown herself on his breast and told him all she felt. But to Mr. Gradgrind, marriage was only a cold fact with no romance in it, and his manner chilled her. Tom, in his utter selfishness, thought only of what a good thing it would be for him if his sister married his employer, and urged it on her with no regard whatever for her own liking. At length, thinking, as long as she had never been allowed to have a sentiment that could not be put down in black and white, that it did not much marry whom she married after all, and believing that, at least, it would help Tom, she consented. She married Bounderby, the richest man in Coketown, and went to live in his fine house, while Mrs. Sparsit, the housekeeper, angry and revengeful, found herself compelled to move into the small rooms over Bounderby's bank. End of section 58. Reading by Julia Wells, Wellington, New Zealand. Section number 59 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julia Wells. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. Hard Times. The Robbery of Bounderby's Bank. In one of Bounderby's weaving mills, a man named Stephen Blackpool had worked for years. He was sturdy and honest, but had a stooping frame, a knitted brow, and iron-grey hair, for in his 40 years he had known much trouble. Many years before he had married. Unhappily, for through no fault or failing of his own, his wife took to drink, left off work, and became a shame and a disgrace to the town. When she could get no money to buy drink with, she sold his furniture, and he would often come home from the mill to find the rooms stripped of all their belongings, and his wife stretched on the floor in drunken slumber. At last he was compelled to pay her to stay away, and even then he lived in daily fear lest she return to disgrace him afresh. What made this harder for Stephen to bear was the true love he had for a sweet, patient, working woman in the mill named Rachel. She had an oval, delicate face, with gentle eyes and dark, shining hair. She knew his story and loved him too. He could not marry her because his own wife stood in the way, nor could he even see or walk with her often, for fear busy tongues might talk of it, but he watched every flutter of her shawl. One night Stephen went home to his lodging to find his wife returned. She was lying drunk across his bed, a besotted creature, stained and splashed, and evil to look at. All that night he sat sleepless and sick of heart. Next day, at the noon hour, he went to his employer's house to ask his advice. He knew the law sometimes released two people from the marriage tie, when one or the other lived wickedly, and his whole heart longed to marry Rachel. But Bounderby told him bluntly that the law he had in mind was only for rich men, who could afford to spend a great deal of money. And he further added, according to his usual custom, that he had no doubt Stephen would soon be demanding to be fed the turtle soup and venison and the golden spoon. Stephen went home that night hopeless, knowing what he should find there. But Rachel had heard and was there before him. She had tidied the room and was tending the woman who was his wife. It seemed to Stephen, as he saw her work of mercy, there was an angel's halo about her head. Soon the wretched creature she had aided passed out of his daily life again, to go he knew not where, and this act of Rachel's remained to make his love and longing greater. About this time a stranger came to Coketown. He was James Harthouse, a suave, polished man of the world, good-looking, well-dressed, with a gallant yet indolent manner, and bold eyes. Being wealthy, he had tried the army, tried a government position, tried Jerusalem, tried yachting, and found himself bored by them all. At last he had tried facts and figures, having some idea that these might help in politics. In London he had met the great believer in facts, Mr. Gradgrind, and had been sent by him to Coketown to make the acquaintance of his friend Bounderby. Harthouse thus met the mill owner, who introduced him to Louisa, now his wife. The year of married life had not been a happy one for her. She was reserved and watchful and cold as ever, but Harthouse easily saw that she was ashamed of Bounderby's bragging talk, and shrank from his coarseness as from a blow. He soon perceived, too, that the only love she had for anyone was given to Tom, though the latter little deserved it. In his own mind, Harthouse called her father a machine, her brother a whelp, and her husband a bear. Harthouse was attracted by Louisa's beauty no less than by her pride. He was without conscience or honour, and determined, though she was already married, to make her fall in love with him. He knew the surest way to her liking was to pretend an interest in Tom, and he at once began to flatter the sullen young fellow. Under his influence, the latter was not long in telling the story of Louisa's marriage, and in boasting that he himself had brought it about for his own advancement. To Louisa, Harthouse spoke regretfully of the lad's idle habits, yet hopefully of his future, so that she, deeming him honestly Tom's friend, confided in him, telling him of her brother's love of gambling, and how she had more than once paid his debts by selling some of her own jewellery. In such ways as these, Harthouse, step by step, gained an intimacy with her. While Harthouse was thus setting his net, Stephen Blackpool, the mill worker, was on trial. It was a time of great dissatisfaction among workmen throughout the country. In many towns they were banding themselves together into unions, in order to gain more privileges and higher wages from their employers. This movement in time had reached Coketown. Rachel was opposed to these unions, believing they would in the end do their members more harm than good, and, knowing her mind, Stephen had long ago promised that he would never join one. The day had come, however, when a workman who thus declined was looked on with suspicion and disliked by his fellows, and at length, though all had liked and respected Stephen, because he steadfastly refused to join the rest, he found himself shunned. Day after day he went to and from his work alone, and spoken to by no one, and, not seeing Rachel in these days, was lonely and disheartened. This condition of things did not escape the eye of Bounderby, who sent for Stephen and questioned him. But even in his trouble, thinking his fellow workmen believed themselves in the right, Stephen refused to complain or to bear tales of them. Bounderby, in his arrogance, chose to be angry that one of the mill hands should presume not to answer his questions, and discharged him forthwith, so that now Stephen found himself without friends, money, or work. Not wholly without friends, either, for Rachel was still the same, and he had gained another friend too. While he told her that evening in his lodgings what had occurred, and that he must soon go in search of work in some town or other, Louisa came to him. She had witnessed the interview in which her husband had discharged this faithful workman, had found out where he lived, and had made her brother Tom bring her there that she might tell Stephen how sorry she was, and beg him to accept money from her to help in his distress. This kindness touched Stephen. He thanked her and took as a loan a small portion of the money she offered him. Tom had come out on this errand with his sister in a sulky humour. While he listened now, a thought came to him. As Louisa talked with Rachel, he beckoned Stephen from the room and told him that he could perhaps aid him in finding work. He told him to wait during the next 2 or 3 evenings near the door of Bounderby's bank, and promised that he himself would seek Stephen there and tell him further. There was no kindness, however, in this proposal. It was a sudden plan, wicked and cowardly. Tom had become a criminal. He had stolen money from the bank and trembled daily lest the theft become known. What would be easier now, he thought, than to hide his crime by throwing suspicion on someone else? He could force the door of the safe before he left at night, and rob a key of the bank door, which he had secretly made, in the street where it would afterwards be found. He himself then the next morning could appear to find the safe open and the money missing. Stephen, he considered, would be just the one to throw suspicion on. All unconscious of this plot, Stephen in good faith waited near the bank during these 3 evenings, walking past the building again and again, watching vainly for Tom to appear. Mrs. Sparsit, at her upper window, wondered to see his bowed form haunting the place. Nothing came of his waiting, however, and a 4th morning saw him, with his thoughts on Rachel, trudging out of town along the high road, bravely and uncomplainingly, toward whatever new lot the future held for him. Tom's plot worked well. The next day there was a sensation in Coketown. Bounderby's bank was found to have been robbed. The safe, Tom declared, he had found open, with a large part of its contents missing. A key to the bank door was picked up in the street. This, it was concluded, the thief had thrown away after using. Who had done it? Had any suspicious person been seen about the place? Many people remembered a strange old woman, apparently from the country, who called herself Mrs. Pegler, and who had often been seen standing looking fixedly at the bank. What more natural than to suspect her? Then another rumour began to grow. Stephen Blackpool, discharged from the mill by Bounderby himself, the workman who had been shunned by all his comrades, to whom no one spoke, he had been seen recently loitering, night after night, near the robbed bank. Where was he? Gone, none knew where. In half an hour Stephen was suspected. By the next day half of Coketown believed him guilty. End of section 59. Recording by Julia Wells, Wellington, New Zealand. Section number 60 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julia Wells. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. Section number 60. Hard Times. Harthouse's plan fails. 2 persons, however, had a suspicion of the truth. One of these was the porter of the bank, whose suspicion was strong. The other was Louisa, who, though her love denied it room, hid in her secret heart a fear that her brother had had a share in the crime. In the night she went to Tom's bedside, put her arms around him, and begged him to tell her any secret he might be keeping from her. But he answered sullenly that he did not know what she meant. Mrs. Sparsit's fine-bred nerves, so she insisted, were so shaken by the robbery that she came to Bounderby's house, to remain till she recovered. The feeble, pink-eyed bundle of shawls that was Mrs. Gradgrind, happening to die at this time, and Louisa being absent at her mother's funeral, Mrs. Sparsit saw her opportunity. She had never forgiven Louisa for marrying Bounderby, and now she revenged herself by a course of such flattery that the vulgar bully began to think his cold, proud wife much too regardless of him and of his importance. What pleased the hawk-faced old busybody most was the game that suave Harthouse was playing, which she was sharp to see through at once. If Louisa would only disgrace herself by running away with Harthouse, thought Mrs. Sparsit, Bounderby might be free again, and she might marry him. So she watched narrowly the growing intimacy between them, hoping for Louisa's ruin. There came a day when Bounderby was summoned on business to London, and Louisa stayed meanwhile at the Bounderby country house, which lay some distance from Coketown. Mrs. Sparsit guessed that Harthouse would use this chance to see Louisa alone, and, to spy upon her, she took the train herself, reaching there at nightfall. She went afoot from the station to the grounds, opened the gate softly, and crept close to the house. Here and there in the dusk, through garden and wood, she stole, and at length she found what she sought. There under the trees stood Harthouse, his horse tied near by, and talking to him was Louisa. Mrs. Sparsit stood behind a tree like Robinson Crusoe in his ambuscade against the savages, and listened with all her ears. She could not hear all, but caught enough to know that he was telling her he loved her, and begging her to leave her husband, her home and friends, and to run away with him. In her delight, and in the noise of rain upon the foliage, for a thunderstorm was rolling up, Mrs. Sparsit did not catch Louisa's answer. Where and when Harthouse asked her to join him, she could not hear, but as he mounted and rode away, she thought he said, "Tonight." She waited in the rain, rejoicing, till her patience was at length rewarded by seeing Louisa, cloaked and veiled as if for a journey, come from the house and go toward the railroad station. Then Mrs. Sparsit, drawing her draggled shawl over her head to hide her face, followed, boarded the same train, and hastened to tell the news of his wife's elopement to Bounderby in London. Wet to the skin, her feet squashing in her shoes, her clothes spoiled, and her bonnet looking like an overripe fig, with a terrible cold that made her voice only a whisper, and sneezing herself almost to pieces, Mrs. Sparsit found Bounderby at his city hotel, exploded with the combustible information she carried, and fainted quite away on his coat collar. Furious at the news she brought, Bounderby hustled her into a fast train, and together, he raging and glaring, she inwardly jubilant, they hurried towards Coketown to inform Mr. Gradgrind, who was then at home, of his daughter's doings. But where, meanwhile, was Louisa? Not run away with Harthouse, as Mrs. Sparsit so fondly imagined, but safe in her own father's house in Coketown. She had suffered much without complaint, but Harthouse's proposal had been the final straw. Added to all the insults she had suffered at her husband's hands, and her fearful suspicion of Tom's guilt, it had proven too much for her to bear. She had pretended to agree to Harthouse's plan only that she might the more quickly rid herself of his presence. Mr. Gradgrind, astonished at her sudden arrival at Stone Lodge, was shocked no less at her ghastly appearance than by what she said. She told him she cursed the hour when she had been born to grow up a victim to his teachings, that her whole life had been empty, that every hope, affection, and fancy had been crushed from her very infancy, and her better angel made a demon. She told him the whole truth about her marriage to Bounderby, that she had married him solely for the advancement of Tom, the only one she had ever loved, and that now she could no longer live with her husband or bear the life she had made for herself. And when she had said this, Louisa, the daughter his system had brought to such despair, fell at his feet. At her pitiful tale, the tender heart that Mr. Gradgrind had buried in his long-past youth under his mountain of facts stirred again and began to beat. The mountain crumbled away, and he saw in an instant, as by a lightning flash, that the plan of life to which he had so rigidly held was a complete and hideous failure. He had thought that there was but one wisdom, that of the head. He knew at last that there was a deeper wisdom of the heart also, which all these years he had denied. When she came to herself, Louisa found her father sitting by her bedside. His face looked worn and older. He told her he had realized at last his life mistake and bitterly reproached himself. Sissy, too, was there, her love shining like a beautiful light on the other's darkness. She knelt beside the bed and laid the weary head upon her breast, and then for the first time Louisa burst into sobs. Next day Sissy sought out Harthouse, who was waiting, full of sulky impatience at the failure of Louisa to appear as he had expected. Sissy told him plainly what had occurred, and that he should never see Louisa again. Harthouse, realizing that his plan had failed, suddenly discovered that he had a great liking for camels, and left the same hour for Egypt, never to return to Coketown. It was while Sissy was absent on this errand of her own that the furious Bounderby and the triumphant Mrs. Sparsit, the latter voiceless and still sneezing, appeared at Stone Lodge. Mr. Gradgrind took the mill owner greatly aback with the statement that Louisa had had no intention whatever of eloping, and was then in that same house and under his care. Angry and blustering at being made such a fool of, Bounderby turned on Mrs. Sparsit, but in her disappointment at finding it a mistake, she had dissolved in tears. When Mr. Gradgrind told him he had concluded that it would be better for Louisa to remain for some time there with him, Bounderby flew into a still greater rage, and stamped off, swearing his wife should come home by noon the next day, or not at all. To be sure, Louisa did not go, and next day Bounderby sent her clothes to Mr. Gradgrind, advertised his country house for sale, and, needing something to take his spite out upon, redoubled his efforts to find the robber of the bank. And he began by covering the town with printed placards, offering a large regard for the arrest of Stephen Blackpool. End of section 60. Recording by Julia Wells, Wellington, New Zealand. Section number 61 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julia Wells. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. Section 61. Hard Times. Stephen's Return. Rachel had known, of course, of the rumours against Stephen, and had been both indignant and sorrowful. She alone knew where he was, and how to find him, for, deeming it impossible, because of his trouble with the Coketown workmen, to get work under his own name, he had taken another. Now that he was directly charged with the crime, she wrote him the news at once, so that he might lose no time in returning to face the unjust accusation. Being so certain herself of his innocence, she made no secret of what she had done, and all Coketown waited, wondering whether he would appear or not. 2 days passed, and he had not come, and then Rachel told Bounderby the address to which she had written to him. Messengers were sent, who came back with the report that Stephen had received her letter and had left at once, saying he was going to Coketown, where he should long since have arrived. Another day with no Stephen, and now almost everyone believed he was guilty, had taken Rachel's letter as a warning, and had fled. All the while Tom waited nervously, biting his nails and with fevered lips, knowing that Stephen, when he came, would tell the real reason why he had loitered near the bank, and so point suspicion to himself. On the 3rd day, Mrs. Sparsit saw a chance to distinguish herself. She recognized on the street Mrs. Pegler, the old country woman who also had been suspected. She seized her and, regardless of her entreaties, dragged her to Bounderby's house and into his dining room, with a curious crowd flocking at their heels. She plumed herself on catching one of the robbers, but what was her astonishment when the old woman called Bounderby her dear son, pleading that her coming to his house was not her fault, and begging him not to be angry even if people did know at last that she was his mother. Mr. Gradgrind, who was present when they entered, having always heard Bounderby tell such dreadful tales of his bringing up, reproached her for deserting her boy in his infancy to a drunken grandmother. At this the old woman nearly burst with indignation, calling on Bounderby himself to tell how false this was, and how she had pinched and denied herself for him till he had begun to be successful. Everybody laughed at this, for now the true story of the bullying mill owner's tales were out. Bounderby, who had turned very red, was the only one who did not seem to enjoy the scene. After he had wrathfully shut everyone else out of the house, he vented his anger on Mrs. Sparsit for meddling, as he called it, with his own family affairs. He ended by giving her the wages due to her, and inviting her to take herself off at once. So Mrs. Sparsit, for all her cap-setting and spying, had to leave her comfortable nest and go to live in a poor lodging as a companion to the most grudging, peevish, tormenting one of her noble relatives, an invalid with a lame leg. But meanwhile another day had passed, the fourth since Rachel had sent her letter, and still Stephen had not come. On this day, full of her trouble, Rachel had wandered with Sissy, now her fast friend, some distance out of the town, through some fields where mining had once been carried on. Suddenly she cried out. She had picked up a hat, and inside it was the name Stephen Blackpool. An instant later, a scream broke from her lips that echoed over the countryside. Before them, at their very feet, half hidden by rubbish and grasses, yawned the ragged mouth of a dark, abandoned shaft. That instant both Rachel and Sissy guessed the truth, that Stephen, returning, had not seen the chasm in the darkness, and had fallen into its depths. They ran and roused the town. Crowds came from Coketown. Rope and windlass were brought, and 2 men were lowered into the pit. The poor fellow was there, alive but terribly injured. A rough bed was made, and so at last the crushed and broken form was brought up to the light and air. A surgeon was at hand with wine and medicines, but it was too late. Stephen spoke with Rachel first, then called Mr. Gradgrind to him, and asked him to clear the blemish from his name. He told him simply that he could do so through his son Tom. That was all. He died while they bore him home, holding the hand of Rachel, whom he loved. Stephen's last words had told the truth to Mr. Gradgrind. He read in them that his own son was the robber. Tom's guilty glance had seen also. With suspicion removed from Stephen, he felt his own final arrest sure. Sissy noted Tom's pale face and trembling limbs. Guessing that he would attempt flight too late, and longing to save the heartbroken father from the shame of seeing his son's arrest and imprisonment, she drew the shaking thief aside, and in a whisper bade him go at once to Sleary, the proprietor of the circus, to which her father had once belonged. She told him where the circus was to be found at that season of the year, and bade him ask Sleary to hide him, for her sake, till she came. Tom obeyed. He disappeared that night, and later Sissy told his father what she had done. Mr. Gradgrind, with Sissy and Louisa, followed as soon as possible, intending to get his son to the nearest seaport and so out of the country on a vessel, for he knew that soon he himself, Tom's father, would be questioned and obliged to tell the truth. They travelled all night, and at length reached a town where the circus showed. Sleary, for Sissy's sake, had provided Tom with a disguise in which not even his father recognized him. He had blackened his sullen face, and dressed him in a moth-eaten greatcoat and a mad cocked hat, in which attire he played the role of a black servant in the performance. Tom met them, grimy and defiant, ashamed to meet Louisa's eyes, brazen to his father, anxious only to be saved from his deserved punishment. A seaport was but 3 hours away. He was soon dressed, and plans for his departure were completed. But at the last moment danger appeared. It came in the person of the porter of Bounderby's bank, who had all along suspected Tom. He had watched the Gradgrind house, followed its master when he left, and now laid hands on Tom, vowing he would take him back to Coketown. In this moment of the father's despair, Sleary the showman saved the day for the shivering thief. He agreed with the porter that, as Tom was guilty of a crime, he must certainly go with him, and he offered, moreover, to drive the captor and his prisoner at once to the nearest railroad station. He winked at Sissy as he proposed this, and she was not alarmed. The porter accepted the proposal at once, but did not guess what the showman had in mind. Sleary's horse was an educated horse. At a certain word from its owner it would stop and begin to dance, and would not budge from the spot until he gave the command, in a particular way. He had an educated dog, too, that would also do anything that was told. With this horse hitched to the carriage, and this dog trotting innocently behind, the showman set off with the porter, and Tom, while Mr. Gradgrind and Louisa, whom Sissy had told to trust in Sleary, waited all night for his return. It was morning before Sleary came back, with the news that Tom was undoubtedly safe from pursuit, if not already aboard ship. He told them how, at the word from him, the educated horse had begun to dance, how Tom had slipped down and got away, while the educated dog, at his command, had penned the frightened porter in the carriage all night, fearing to stir. Thus Tom, who did not deserve any such good luck, got safely away, but though his father was spared the shame of ever seeing his son behind the bars of a jail, yet he was a broken man ever after the truth became known. What was the fate of all these? Bounderby, a bully to the last, died of a fit 5 years afterwards, leaving his entire fortune to the perpetual support of 25 humbugs, each of whom was required to take the name of Josiah Bounderby of Coketown. Louisa never remarried, but lived to be the comfort of her father and the loving comrade of Sissy Jupe. Sissy never found her father, and when at last Merrylegs, his wonderful dog, came back alone to die of old age at Sleary's feet, all knew that his master must be dead. Tom died, softened and penitent, in a foreign land. Rachel remained the same pensive little worker, always dressed in black, beloved by all and helping everyone, even Stephen's besotted wife. As for Mr. Gradgrind, a white-haired, decrepit old man, he forgot all the facts on which he had so depended, and tried for ever after to mingle his life's acts with faith, hope, and charity. End of section 61. Recording by Julia Wells, Wellington, New Zealand.
Section 62 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Libby Gohn. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. The Mystery of Edwin Drood. John Jasper. In the quiet town of Cloisterham in England, in a boarding school, once lived a beautiful girl named Rosa Budd, an amiable, willful, willing, whimsical little creature whom everyone called Rosebud. She was an orphan. Her mother had been drowned when she was only 7 years old, and her father had died of grief on the first anniversary of that day. Her father's friend and college mate, Mr. Drood, had comforted his last hours, and they had agreed between them that when Rosebud was old enough she should marry Mr. Drood's son, Edwin, then a little boy. Her father put this wish in his will, as did Mr. Drood, who died soon after his friend. So Rosebud and Edwin Drood grew up knowing that, though not bound in any way, each was intended for the other. While if they had been let alone together they might have fallen in love naturally. Yet as it was they were always shy and ill at ease with one another. Yet they liked each other too. Rosebud's guardian was a Mr. Grewgious, an arid, sandy man who looked as if he might be put in a grinding mill and turned out first-class snuff. He had scanty hair like a yellow fur tippet, and deep notches in his forehead, and was very near-sighted. He seemed to have been born old, so that when he came to London to call on Rosebud amid all the schoolgirls, he used to say he felt like a bear with a cramp. Grewgious, however, under his oddity, had a very tender heart, particularly for Rosebud, whose mother he had been secretly in love with before she married. But he had grown up a dry old bachelor, living in gloomy rooms in London, and no one would have guessed him ever to have been a bit romantic. The school Rosebud attended was called Nuns' House. Mrs. Twinkleton, a prim old maid who managed it, termed it a seminary for young ladies. It had a worn front, with a shining brass door-plate that made it look at a distance like a battered old beau with a big new eyeglass stuck in his blind eye. Here Rosebud lived a happy life, the pet of the whole seminary, till she was a young lady. Cloisterham was a dull, grey town with an ancient cathedral, which was so cold and dark and damp that looking into its door was like looking down the throat of old Father Time. The cathedral had a fine choir, which sang at all the services, and was taught and led by a music-master whose name was John Jasper. This Jasper, as it happened, was the uncle and guardian of Edwin Drood. Drood, who was studying to be an engineer, was very fond of his uncle, and came often to Cloisterham to visit him, so that Rosebud saw a great deal of her intended husband. He always called her Pussy. He used to call on her at the school and take her walking and buy her candy at a Turkish shop called Lumps of Delight, and did his best to get on well with her, though he felt awkward. Drood and Jasper were much more like two friends than like uncle and nephew, for the choir-master was very little older than the other. Jasper seemed to be wonderfully fond of Drood, and everyone who knew him thought him a most honourable and upright man, but in reality he was far different. At heart he hated the cathedral and the singing, and wished often that he could find relief, like some old monk, in carving demons out of the desks and seats. He had a soul that was without fear or conscience. One vile and wicked practice he had, which he hid from all who knew him. He was an opium smoker. He would steal away to London to a garret kept by a mumbling old woman who knew the secret mixing of the drug, and there, stretched on a dirty pallet, sometimes with a drunken Chinaman or a lascar beside him, would smoke pipe after pipe of the dreadful mixture that stole away his senses and left him worse than before. Hours later he would awake, give the woman money, and hurry back to Cloisterham, just in time, perhaps, to put on his church robes and lead the cathedral choir. No one knew of this, and though Edwin Drood thought his uncle was well nigh perfect, Rosebud, as she grew up, had no liking for Jasper. He gave her music lessons, and every time they met he terrified her. She felt sometimes that he haunted her thoughts like a dreadful ghost. He seemed almost to make a slave of her with his looks, and she felt that in every glance he was telling her that he, Jasper, loved her, and yet compelled her to keep silence. But though disliking the choir-master so, and shivering when he came near her, Rosebud did not know how to tell Edwin, who she knew loved and believed in Jasper, of her feelings. End of section 62. Section 63 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. The Mystery of Edwin Drood. The Coming of Neville Landless. One of the ministers in charge of the cathedral was the Reverend Mr. Crisparkle, a ruddy, young, active, honest fellow, who was perpetually practising boxing before the looking-glass, or pitching himself head foremost into all the streams about the town for a swim, even when it was winter and he had to break the ice with his head. Mr. Crisparkle sometimes took young men into his home to live while he tutored them to prepare them for college. One day he received word from a Mr. Luke Honeythunder in London, telling him he was about to bring to Cloisterham a twin brother and sister, Neville and Helena Landless, the young man to be taught by Mr. Crisparkle, and his sister Helena to be put in Miss Twinkleton's seminary. This Luke Honeythunder called himself a philanthropist, but he was a queer sort of a one indeed. He was always getting up public meetings and talking loudly, insisting on everybody's thinking exactly as he did, and saying dreadful things of them that did not. Helena and Neville Landless had been born in Ceylon, where as little children they had been cruelly treated by their stepfather. But they had brave spirits, and 4 times in 6 years they had run away, only to be brought back each time and punished. On each of the occasions, the first had been when they were but 7 years old, Helena had dressed as a boy, and once had even tried to cut off her hair with Neville's pocket-knife. At length their cruel stepfather died, and they were sent to England, where, for no other reason than that his name was continually appearing in the newspapers, Mr. Honeythunder had been appointed their guardian. No wonder the brother and sister had grown up thinking everybody was their enemy. They were quite prepared to hate Mr. Crisparkle when their guardian brought them. But by the time Mr. Honeythunder had gone, and Mr. Crisparkle was as glad as they were when he went home, they liked the young minister, and felt that they would be happy there. They were a handsome pair, and Mr. Crisparkle was attracted to both of them. Neville was lithe and dark and rich in colour. Helena was almost like a gypsy, slender and supple and quick. Both seemed half shy, half defiant, as though their blood were untamed. To make them welcome that first evening, Mr. Crisparkle invited to his house Jasper, the choir-master, with Edwin Drood, who was visiting him, and Rosebud from the seminary. Before they parted, Rosebud was asked to sing. Jasper played her accompaniment, and while she sang he watched her lips intently. All at once, to their great astonishment, Rosebud covered her face with her hands, crying out, "I can't bear this! I am frightened! Take me away!" burst into tears. Helena, the newcomer, who had liked Rosebud at first sight, seemed to understand her better than anyone else. She laid her on a sofa, soothed her, and in a few moments Rosebud seemed again as usual. Mr. Crisparkle and Edwin Drood thought it only a fit of nervousness. To her relief they made light of the matter, and so the evening ended. But later, at Nunn's house, where she and Helena were to be roommates, Rosebud told her new friend how much she disliked Jasper, and how his eyes terrified her, and how, as she sang, with his eyes watching her lips, she felt as if he had kissed her. While the two girls were talking of this, Neville and Edwin Drood, who had gone with them as far as the door of the seminary, were walking back together. Mr. Crisparkle had told Neville of Drood's betrothal to Rosebud, and Neville now spoke of it. Drood, who had felt all along that he and Rosebud did not get along well together, and who was sensitive on the subject, was unjustly angry that the other should so soon know what he considered his own private affair. He answered in a surly way, and as both were quick-tempered, they soon came to high words. As it happened, Jasper was walking near, and overhearing came between them. He reproved them good-naturedly, and took them to his rooms, where he insisted they should drink a glass of wine with him to their good fellowship. There he did a dastardly thing. He mixed with the wine a drug which once drunk aroused their angry passions. Their speech grew thick, and the quarrel began again. Safe now from any spectator, Jasper did not attempt to soothe them. He let them go on until they were about to come to blows. Then, pretending the greatest indignation, he threw himself upon Neville and forced him hatless from the house. In the cool night air, Neville's strange dizziness, and with it his rage, cleared away. He realized that the blame for the quarrel had been Jasper's, but he did not guess the drugging of the wine, and could not explain the incident even to himself. He went, however, manfully and sorrowfully to Mr. Crisparkle, and told him what had occurred. And naturally Mr. Crisparkle, who had never found Edwin Drood quarrelsome, thought it the fault of Neville's hot blood and revengeful character. He was more certain of this when Jasper came to him, bringing Neville's hat, and told him his own story of the meeting. Jasper told him falsely that Neville had made a murderous attack on Drood, and but for him would have laid his nephew dead at his feet. He warned the minister that Neville had a tigerish nature, and would yet be guilty of a terrible crime. Mr. Crisparkle liked Neville, and all this saddened him, for he had not the least suspicion that Jasper was lying for a cruel purpose of his own. The affair was an unhappy one for Neville. Jasper took care that the story spread abroad, and as it went it grew, so that almost everybody in Cloisterham came to consider Helena's brother a sullen fellow of a furious temper. And they believed it the more because Neville made no secret of the fact that he had fallen in love too with Rosebud, and in this they saw a reason for his hating Edwin Drood. Mr. Crisparkle was a faithful friend. He concluded soon that the fault was not all on Neville's side, and he was anxious to have the two young men friends, and he begged his pupil for his own part to lay aside the ill feeling. He went to the choirmaster also on the same errand, and Jasper assured him that his nephew would do the same. He even promised, hypocritically, that to bring this about he would invite both Edwin Drood and Neville to dine with him on Christmas Eve in his own rooms, where they might meet and shake hands. Both young men promised to come to the dinner, and Mr. Crisparkle was highly pleased, little dreaming what the outcome would be. End of section 63. Section 64 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. The Mystery of Edwin Drood. The Choirmaster's Dinner. There was a quaint character in Cloisterham named Durndals. He was a stonemason whose specialty was the chiselling of tombstones. He was an old bachelor, and was both a very skilful workman and a very great sot. He had keys to all the cathedral vaults, and was fond of prowling about the old pile and its dismal crypt, forever tap-tapping, with a little hammer he carried, on its stones and walls, hunting for forgotten cavities, in which, perhaps, centuries before, persons had been buried. He wore a coarse flannel suit with horn buttons and a yellow handkerchief with draggled ends, and it was a daily sight to see him perched on a tombstone eating his dinner out of a bundle. When he was not feeling well, he used to say he had a touch of rheumatism instead of rheumatism. Durdles was drunk so much that he was never certain about getting home at night, so he had hired, at a penny a day, a hideous small boy, known as the Deputy, to throw stones at him whenever he found him out of doors after 10 o'clock, and drive him home to his little hole of an unfurnished stone house. The Deputy used to watch for Durdles at this hour, and when he saw him he would dance up and sing, "Widdy widdy when I catches him out arter 10, widdy widdy why, when he don't go then I shy, widdy widdy wakecock warning." And it was a part of the bargain that he must give this warning before he began to throw stones, and when Durdles heard this yell he knew what was coming. Before the Christmas Eve dinner, Jasper picked up a friendship with Durdles, and pretending he wanted to make a trip by moonlight with him among the vaults, he persuaded him one night to be his guide. When they were in the crypt of the cathedral, Jasper plied him with liquor which he had brought, to such a purpose that Durdles was fast asleep, and the key of his crypt fell from his hand. He had a dim idea that Jasper picked up the key and went away with it, and was a long time gone. But when he awoke he could not tell whether this had really happened or not. And this, when the Deputy stoned him home at night, was all he could remember of the expedition. But what Jasper had really done while Durdles was asleep, whether he had taken away the key to make a copy of it so as to make one like it for some evil purpose of his own, or whether he wanted to be able to unlock the dark underground place and hide something in it some time when no one would be with him, this only Jasper himself knew. The Christmas season arrived, and Edwin Drood, according to his promise, came to Cloisterham to his uncle's dinner, at which he was to meet Neville. Before leaving, however, he called upon Mr. Grewgious, Rosebud's guardian, who had sent for him with a particular purpose. This purpose was to give into his hands a ring set with diamonds and rubies that had belonged to Rosebud's mother. It had been left in trust to Mr. Grewgious to give to the man who married her, that he might himself put it on her finger. In accordance with the trust, the lawyer charged Drood, if anything should be amiss, or if anything happened between him and Rosebud, to bring back the ring. Mr. Grewgious gave him this keepsake with such wise and friendly advice on the seriousness of marriage, that all the way to Cloisterham, with the ring in his pocket, Edwin Drood was very thoughtful. He asked himself whether he really loved Rosebud as a man should love his wife, whether he had not drifted into this betrothal rather as a result of his parents' wish and wills than from any deeper feeling, and he began to wonder if by marrying her thus he would not be doing her a vast injustice. He decided, therefore, to tell her all that was in his mind, and be guided by her judgment. Rosebud, meanwhile, in the silence of the Christmas vacation, with only Helena for her companion, had been thinking of the same matter, and her wise little head had reached almost the same conclusion. When Drood came, they walked out together under the trees by the cathedral. Their talk was not so difficult after all as each feared it would be, and both felt relieved when they decided they could be far happier to remain as brother and sister, and not to become husband and wife. So they agreed without pain on either side. Drood's only anxiety was for his uncle. He thought Jasper had looked forward to his marriage to Rosebud so long that he would be pained and disappointed to learn it was not to be. So he concluded he would not tell him as yet. Poor Rosebud, she was greatly agitated. She felt the falseness of Jasper, and knew that he loved her himself, but she realized the impossibility of telling this to the nephew who believed in him, so she was silent. Drood, for his part, since the betrothal was ended, said nothing to her of the ring Grewgious had given to him, intending to return it to the lawyer. They kissed each other when they parted. The wicked choir-master, who happened to be walking near, saw the embrace, and thought it the kiss of lovers soon to be wed. Drood left Rosebud then, to pass the time till the hour of the dinner in Jasper's rooms. Neville that day had determined, the dinner over, to start at dawn the next morning on a walking tour, to be absent a fortnight. He bought a knapsack and a heavy steel-shod stick in preparation for this expedition, and bade his sister Helena and Mr. Crisparkle good-bye before he went to the appointed meeting at the choir-master's. Jasper himself, it was noticed, had never seemed in better spirits than on that day, nor had he ever sung more sweetly in the afternoon service before the dinner which he gave to the two young men. If he was contemplating a terrible crime, no one would have guessed it from his serene face and his agreeable manner. Edwin Drood had one warning just before he went up to the postern stair that led to his Uncle Jasper's. The old hag who mixed the opium in the London garret where the choirmaster smoked the drug had more than once tried to find out who her strange, gentlemanly visitor was. She had listened to his mutterings in his drunken slumber, and at length that day had followed him from London to Cloisterham, only to lose track of him there. As Drood strolled, waiting for the dinner hour to strike from the cathedral chimes, he passed her, and she begged money from him. He gave it to her, and she asked his name and whether he had a sweetheart. He answered Edwin, and that he had none. "Be thankful your name's not Ned," she said, "for it's a bad name and a threatened name." Ned was the name Jasper always called him by, but Drood did not think seriously of the old woman's words. He could not have guessed that the threat she spoke of against the Ned who had a sweetheart had been murmured in this drugged slumber by his own uncle against himself, and yet something at just that moment made him shudder. So the chimes struck, and Edwin Drood went on to Jasper's rooms to meet his uncle and Neville Landless, went to his doom. For from that time no one who loved him ever saw him again in this world. End of section 64. Section 65 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Jasper shows his teeth. That night a fearful tempest howled over Cloisterham. In the morning early, as the storm was breaking, Jasper, the choirmaster, came pale, panting, and half-dressed to Mr. Crisparkle's, asking for Edwin Drood. He said his nephew had left his rooms the evening before with Neville Landless to go to the river to look at the storm, and had not returned. Strange rumours sprang up at once. Neville had left for his walking tour, and an ugly suspicion flew from house to house. He had only got a few miles from the town when he was overtaken by a party of men who surrounded him. Thinking at first that they were thieves, he fought them, but was soon rendered helpless and bleeding, and in the midst of them was taken back towards Cloisterham. Mr. Crisparkle and Jasper met them on the way, and from the former Neville first learned of what he was suspected. The blood from his encounter with his captors was on his clothes and stick. Jasper pointed it out, and even those who had seen it fall there looked darkly at the stains. He was taken back to the town, and to Mr. Crisparkle's house, who promised that he should remain in his own custody. Neville's story was simple. He said they had gone to the river, as Jasper had said, and returned together, he to Mr. Crisparkle's, Edwin Drood to his uncle's. He had not seen the other since that time. The river was dragged, and its banks were searched, but to no purpose, till Mr. Crisparkle himself found Drood's watch caught among some timbers in a weir. But as the body could not be found, it could not be definitely proven that Drood was dead, or that any murder had been committed, so at last Neville was released. The whole neighbourhood, however, believed him guilty of the murder. No one spoke to him, and he was obliged to quit the place. Beside his sister Helena and Rosebud, who of course believed in his innocence, he had but one friend there, Mr. Crisparkle. The latter stoutly refused to believe him guilty. When Neville left for London, through Mr. Grewgious, Rosebud's guardian, the minister found him a cheap lodging and made frequent trips to the city to help and advise him in his studies. Mr. Grewgious had his own opinion of the affair. One day he went to Cloisterham to see Jasper, and there told him a thing the other did not yet know, that before that last night Edwin Drood and Rosebud had agreed not to marry. When he heard this, the choirmaster's face turned the colour of lead. He shrieked and fell senseless at the lawyer's feet. Mr. Grewgious went back to the city, more thoughtful than ever. and it was not long before a detective came from London to Cloisterham, and began to interest himself in all the doings of John Jasper. The detective, to be sure, was not known as such. He called himself Dick Datchery, and gave it out that he was an idle dog who lived on his money and had nothing to do. He was a curious-looking man, with a great shock of white hair, black eyebrows, and a military air. He rented lodgings next door to the choirmaster, and before long had made friends with Durdles, the tombstone maker, and even with the deputy of the Wakecock warning. Meanwhile, Jasper, haggard and red eyes, took again his place in the cathedral choir, while Neville Landless worked sadly and alone in his London garret. The latter made but one friend in this time, a lodger whose window adjoined his own. This lodger was Lieutenant Tartar, a retired young naval officer. Tartar might have lived in fine apartments, for he was rich, but he had been so long on shipboard that he felt more at home where the walls were low enough for him to knock his head on the ceiling. He used to climb across to Neville's room by the window ledges, and they became friendly, the warmer friends when Mr. Crisparkle discovered in the lieutenant a schoolmate who had once saved his life. Later, too, Helena left Miss Twinkleton's seminary and came to be with her brother, and so a year went by. Vacation arrived, and one day when Rosebud was alone at Nunn's house, Jasper, for the first time since Edwin Drood's disappearance, came to see her. He found her in the garden, and she felt again the repulsion and fear she had always felt at sight of him. This time the choirmaster threw away all concealment. He told her that he had always loved her hopelessly and madly, though while she was betrothed to his nephew he had hidden the fact. She answered indignantly that by look, if not by word, he had always been false to Edwin Drood, and that he had made her life unhappy by his pursuit of her, and that though she had shrunk from opening his nephew's eyes, she had always known he was a wicked man. Then, maddened by her dislike, Jasper swore that no one else should ever marry her, that he would pursue her to the death, and that if she repulsed him, he would bring dreadful ruin upon Neville Landless. He said this, no doubt, knowing that Neville loved Rosebud, and thinking perhaps that she loved him in return. When Jasper left her, Rosebud was faint from fear of his wicked eyes. She made up her mind to go at once for protection to Mr. Grewgious in London, and leaving a note for Miss Twinkleton, she left by the next omnibus. She told her guardian her story. He told it to Mr. Crisparkle, who came to London the next morning, and between them they told Lieutenant Tartar. While Rosebud visited Helena, the three men took counsel together, agreeing that Jasper was a villain, and planning how best to deal with him. The next time the choirmaster visited the opium garret, the old woman tracked him back to Cloisterham with more success. With such success, indeed, that she heard him sing in the cathedral, and found out his name from a stranger whom she encountered. This stranger was Dick Datchery, the detective, who discovered so much, before he left her, of Jasper's London habits, that he went home in high good humour. Datchery had a trick, whenever he was following a particular search, of marking each step of his progress by a chalk mark on a wall or door. Today he must have been highly pleased, for he drew a thick line from the very top of the cupboard to the bottom. When Charles Dickens, the master storyteller, had told this tale thus far, he fell ill and died, and it was never finished. The mystery of the disappearance of Edwin Drood, what became of Rosebud and of Mr. Crisparkle, how Neville and Helena fared, and what was the end of Jasper, are matters for each one of us to guess. Many have tried to finish this story, and they have ended it in various ways. Before Dickens died, however, he told a friend the part of the story that remained unwritten, and this, the friend has recorded, was to be as follows. By means of the old woman of the opium den, Durdles, the tombstone maker, and the deputy, the ragged stone-thrower, Dick Datchery unravelled the threads which finally, made into a net, caught Jasper, the murderer, in its meshes. Little by little, word by word, he was made at last to betray himself. He had killed Edwin Drood, had hidden his body in one of the vaults and covered it with lime. But there had been one thing in the dead man's pocket which the lime could not destroy. This was the ring set with diamonds and rubies that had been given to him by Mr. Grewgious. By this the murder was proven. Mr. Crisparkle and Mr. Grewgious worked hard to clear Neville Landless, of whose guilt, by the way, Mr. Honeythunder remained always sure. But poor Neville himself perished in aiding Lieutenant Tartar to seize the murderer. Finding all hope of escape gone, Jasper confessed his crime in the cell in which he waited for his death. But after all, the story closed happily, with the marriage of Mr. Crisparkle to Neville's sister Helena, and that of Lieutenant Tartar to pretty little Rosebud. End of section 65.
Section 66 of Tales from Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Samantha Miles. Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES. Charles Dickens. Charles John Huffam Dickens, the master storyteller, was born in Landport, England, February 7th, 1812. His father was a clerk in one of the offices of the Navy, and he was one of 8 children. When he was 4 years old, his father moved to the town of Chatham, near the old city of Rochester. Round about are chalk hills, green lanes, forests, and marshes, and amid such scenes the little Charles' genius first began to show itself. He did not like the rougher sports of his schoolfellows, and preferred to amuse himself in his own way, or to wander about with his older sister, Fanny, whom he especially loved. They loved to watch the stars together, and there was one particular star which they used to pretend was their own. People called him a very queer small boy, because he was always thinking or reading, instead of playing. The children of the neighborhood would gather around him to listen, while he told them stories, or sang comic songs to them, and when he was only 8 years old, he taught them to act in plays which he invented. He was fond of reading books of travel, and most of all, he loved the Arabian Nights and Robinson Crusoe. He had a great affection for Chatham and Rochester, and after he began to write stories that were printed, he often used to put these places into them. It was at Chatham that poor little David in the story, David Copperfield, lay down to sleep when he was running away from London to find his aunt, Miss Betsy Trotwood. It was to Rochester that Mr. Pickwick, in Pickwick Papers, rode with Jingle. Rochester was really the Cloisterham where the wicked choir-master, John Jasper, killed his nephew in the mystery of Edwin Drood. And it was in those very marshes near by that Magwitch, the escaped convict in Great Expectations, so frightened little Pip. It is easy to see that the young Charles Dickens noted carefully and remembered everything he saw, and this habit was of great use to him all his life. These happy years were not to last long. When he was 9 years old, his father became poor, and the family was obliged to move to London, where it lived in a shabby house in a poor suburb. Before another year had passed, his father was put into prison for debt, the same prison in which little Dorrit, in the story of that name, grew up. A very bitter period followed for the solitary 10-year-old boy, a time in which, he long afterward wrote, "But for the mercy of God, he might easily have become, for any care that was taken of him, a little robber or a little vagabond." The earlier history of David in David Copperfield is really and truly a history of the real Charles Dickens in London. He was left to the city streets, or to earn a hard and scanty living in a dirty warehouse, by pasting labels on pots of blacking. All of this wretched experience he has written in David Copperfield, and the sad scenes of the debtor's prison he has put into Pickwick Papers and into Little Dorrit. Even Mrs. Pipchin, of whom he told in Dombey and Son, and Mr. Micawber in David Copperfield, were real people whom he knew in these years of poverty and despair. Dickens' life at this time was so miserable that always afterward he dreaded to speak of it, and never could bear even to walk in the street where the blacking warehouse of his boyhood had stood. Better days, however, came at last. He was able to begin school again, and though the headmaster was ignorant and brutal, just such a one as Mr. Creakle and David Copperfield, yet Dickens profited by such teaching as he received. After 2 or 3 years of school, he found employment as a clerk in a lawyer's office. This did not content him, and he made up his mind to learn to write shorthand so as to become a reporter in the Houses of Parliament for a newspaper. This was by no means an easy task, but Dickens had great strength of will and a determination to do well whatever he did at all, and he succeeded, just as David Copperfield did in the story. And, like the latter too, about this time Dickens fell in love. He did not marry on this occasion, as did David, but how much he was in love one may see by the story of David's Dora. The theatre had always a great attraction for Dickens. Throughout his life he loved to act in plays got up and often written too by himself and his friends. Some of his early experiences of this kind he has told in the adventures of Nicholas Nickleby at Mr. Crummell's theatre. But his acting was for his own amusement, and it is doubtful if he ever thought seriously of adopting the stage as a profession. If he did, his success as a reporter soon determined him otherwise. When he was 21, he saw his first printed sketch in a monthly magazine. He had dropped it into a letter-box with mingled hope and fear, and read it now through tears of joy and pride. He followed this with others as successful, signed Boz, the child nickname of one of his younger brothers. This was his beginning. He was soon on the road to a comfortable fortune, and when at length Pickwick Papers appeared, Dickens' fame was assured. This was his first long story. It became, almost at once, the most popular book of its day, perhaps indeed the most popular book ever published in England. Soon after the appearance of its first chapters, Dickens married Miss Catherine Hogarth, daughter of the editor of one of the London newspapers, who had helped him in his career. Many have tried to explain the marvellous popularity of Pickwick Papers. Certainly its honest fun, its merriment, its quaintness, good humour, and charity appealed to every reader. More than all, it made people acquainted with a new company of characters, none of whom had ever existed, or could ever exist, and yet whose manners and appearance were pictured so really that they seemed to be actual persons whom one might meet and laugh with anywhere. With such a success, and the money it brought him, Dickens had leisure to begin the wonderful series of stories which endeared him to the whole English-speaking world, and made him the most famous author of his day. Oliver Twist came first, and it was followed by Nicholas Nickleby and The Old Curiosity Shop. In the first 2 of these stories one may see most clearly the principle that underlay almost all of Dickens' work. He was never content merely to tell an interesting story. He wrote with a purpose. In Oliver Twist that purpose was, first, to better the poorhouse system, and second, to show that even in the lowest and wickedest paths of life, the life wherein lived Fagin with his pupils in crime, and Bill Sikes the brutal burglar, there could yet be found, as in the case of poor Nancy, real kindness and sacrifice. In Nicholas Nickleby the purpose was to show what terrible wrongs were done to children in country schools, numbers of which at that time were managed by men almost as cruel and inhuman as was Squeers in the story. It is good to learn that, as a result of this novel, an end was made of many such boys' schools. True artist as he was, Dickens seldom wrote without having in his mind the thought of showing some defect in the law, or some wrong condition of affairs which might be righted. No one could read Pickwick Papers, or Little Dorrit, without realizing how much wrong and misery was caused by the law which made it possible to throw a man into prison for debt. Nor can one read Bleak House without seeing that the legal system, which robbed quaint Miss Flite of her mind, and kept poor Richard Carstone from his fortune till the fortune itself had disappeared, was a very wrong legal system indeed. Often, too, Dickens' stories are, in a sense, sermons against very human sins. In The Old Curiosity Shop, it is the sin of gambling which brings about the death of Little Nell. In Great Expectations, it is a sin of pride which Pip has to fight. In Martin Chuzzlewit, The evil and folly of selfishness is what Dickens had in mind. With his increasing wealth, Dickens had, of course, changed his manner of life. He lived part of the time in the country near London, in Brighton, in Dover, and in France and Italy. He liked best, however, a little English watering place called Broadstairs, a tiny fishing village built on a cliff, with the sea rolling and dashing beneath it. In such a place he felt that he could write best, but he greatly missed his London friends. He used to say that being without them was like losing his arms and legs. The first great grief of his life came to him at this time, in the death of his wife's sister, Mary Hogarth, a gentle, lovable girl of 17. No sorrow ever touched him as this did. After she died, he wrote years afterward, I dreamed of her every night for many weeks, and always with a kind of quiet happiness, so that I never lay down at night without a hope of the vision coming back. Hers was the character he drew in Little Nell in The Old Curiosity Shop. When he came to the part of the story which tells of Little Nell's death, he could scarcely write the chapter. When he ended it, he said, It seems as though dear Mary died but yesterday. When he was less than 30, Dickens was invited to visit Scotland, and there he received his first great national tribute. A public banquet was given him in Edinburgh, and he was much sought after and entertained. Up to this time he had never seen the United States. He decided now to visit this country, and meet his American readers face to face. He landed at Boston accompanied by his wife in 1842, and visited many of the greater cities of the Eastern States. Everywhere he was counted the guest of the nation, and the 4 months of his stay were one continual welcome. Unfortunately, however, Dickens had taken a dislike to American ways, and this dislike appeared in many things he wrote after his return to England. The pictures he drew of American life in Martin Chuzzlewit were both unjust and untrue, and made him for a time lose a large part of the good opinion which American readers had had for him. Dickens soon came to regret the writing of these chapters, and when, 25 years later, he visited the United States a second time, he did all in his power to show his kindly feeling, and America admired and loved him so much that it gradually forgot the incident in the great pleasure with which it read his stories. Dickens was a very active man, and his life was simple and full of work and exercise. He rose early, and almost every day might have been seen tramping for miles along the country roads, or riding horseback with his dogs racing after him. He liked best to wander along the cliffs or across the downs by the sea. When he was in London, he often walked the streets half the night, thinking out his stories, or searching for the odd characters which he put in them. This natural activity and restlessness even led him sometimes to make political speeches, and finally to the establishment of a new London newspaper, the Daily News, of which he was the first editor. Before this, he had started a weekly journal, in which several of his stories had appeared, but it had not been very successful. It was not long before he withdrew also from this second venture. In the meantime, he had met with both joy and sorrow. Several children had been born to him. His much-loved sister, his father, and his own little daughter, the youngest of his family, had died. These sorrows made him throw himself into his work with greater earnestness. He often found leisure to organize a theatrical company, in which he himself acted with a number of other famous writers of the time, which gave several plays for the benefit of charity. One of these was performed before Queen Victoria. People have often wondered how Dickens found time to accomplish so many different things. One of the secrets of this, no doubt, was his love of order. He was the most systematic of men. Everything he did went like clockwork, and he prided himself on his punctuality. He could not work in a room unless everything in it was in its proper place. As a consequence of this habit of regularity, he never wasted time. The work of editorship was very pleasant to Dickens, and scarcely 3 years after his leaving the Daily News, he began the publication of a new magazine, which he called Household Words. His aim was to make it cheerful, useful, and at the same time cheap, so that the poor could afford to buy it as well as the rich. His own story, Hard Times, first appeared in this, with the earliest work of more than one writer who later became celebrated. Dickens loved to encourage young writers, and would just as quickly accept a good story or poem from an unknown author as from the most famous. It was while engaged in this work that Dickens wrote the best one of all his tales, David Copperfield, the one which is in so large a part the history of his own early life. This book brought Dickens to the height of his career. He was now both famous and rich. He bought a house on Gad's Hill, a place near Chatham, where he had spent the happiest part of his childhood, and settled down to a life of comfort and labor. When he was a little boy, his father had pointed out this fine house to him, and told him he might even come to live there some day, if he were very persevering and worked hard. And so indeed it had proved. Perhaps it is in connection with the house on Gad's Hill that the world oftenest remembers Dickens now. Everyone, old and young throughout the neighborhood, liked him. Children, dogs, and horses were his friends. His hand was open for charity, and he was always the champion of the poor, the helpless, and the outcast. Everyone, he thought, had some good in him, and in all he met he was on the lookout to find it. The great purpose underneath all his writings was, after all, to teach that every man and woman, however degraded, has his or her better side. So earnest was he in this, that he was not pleased at all when a person praised one of his stories, unless the other showed that he had grasped the lesson that lay beneath it. The text of Dickens' whole life and work is best expressed in his own words. I hope to do some solid good, and I mean to be as cheery and pleasant as I can. The wrongs and sufferings of the young especially appeal to him, and perhaps the most beautiful speech he ever made was one asking for money for the support of the London Hospital for Sick Children. He spoke often in behalf of working men, and once he spoke for the benefit of a company of poor actors, when, unknown to him, a little child of his own was lying dead at home. With such a tender heart for all the world, he was more than an affectionate father to his own children, and gave much thought to their happiness and education. In order that they should properly learn of their own country, he went to the labor of preparing a child's history of England for them, and at another time he wrote out the story of the Gospels, to help them in their study of the New Testament. As the years went by, his letters to his oldest son told of his own work and plans. When his youngest son sailed away to live in Australia, he wrote, "Poor Plorn is gone. It was a hard parting at the last. He seemed to me to become once more my youngest and favorite child as the day drew near, and I did not think I could have been so shaken." When he moved to Gad's Hill, it seemed as though Dickens had gained almost all of the things men strive most for. But he was not to be happy there, nor perhaps was he ever again to be really happy anywhere. He and his wife were very different in all their tastes and habits, and had never loved each other as well as people should when they marry. Perhaps, after all, it would have been better if in his youth he had married his Dora, the one whom he had pictured in the love story of David Copperfield and his child-wife. But, however this may be, Dickens and his wife had not lived happily together, and now decided to part, and from that time, though they wrote to each other, he never saw her again. It is sad to reflect that he who has painted so beautifully for others the joys and sorrows of perfect love and home was himself destined to know neither. The years that followed this separation were years of constant labor for Dickens. His restlessness, perhaps also his lack of happiness, drove him to work without rest. He wrote to a friend, "I am quite confident that I should rust, break, and die if I spared myself. Much better to die doing." The idea of giving public readings from his stories suggested itself to him, and he was soon engaged in preparation. "I must do something," he wrote, "or I shall wear my heart away." That heart his physician had declared out of order, and this effort was destined to wear it away in quite another sense, though for some time Dickens felt no ill effects. He gave readings, not only in England, but also in Scotland and Ireland, and everywhere he met with enormous success. The first series was hardly over when he was at work on a new story, and this was scarcely completed when he was planning more readings. The strain of several seasons of such work told on his health. A serious illness followed, and afterward he was troubled with an increasing lameness, the first real warning of the end. In spite of his weakness, he decided on another trip to America, and here, in 1867, he began a series of readings which left him in a far worse condition. Often at the close of an evening he would become so faint that he would have to lie down. He was unable to sleep, and his appetite entirely failed him. Yet his wonderful determination and energy made him able to complete the task. A great banquet of farewell was given to him in New York, and he returned to England bearing the admiration and love of the whole American people. Before leaving England, he had promised to give one other course of readings there, and this promise, after a summer's quiet at home, he attempted to fulfill. But he was too ill. He found himself for the first time in his life feeling, as he said, giddy, jarred, shaken, faint, uncertain of voice and sight, and tread and touch, and dull of spirit. He was obliged to discontinue the course and to rest. This summer of 1869, the last summer of his life, was a contented and even a happy one. At home, at first in London, and later in the house on Gad's Hill, surrounded by his children and by the friends he loved best, Dickens lived quietly, working at his last story, which his death was to leave forever unfinished, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. He attempted one more series of readings, and with their close bade farewell forever to his English audience. He was seen in public but a few times more, once at the last dinner party he ever attended, to meet the Prince of Wales and the King of the Belgians, and once when the Queen invited him to Buckingham Palace. Soon after, the end came. One day, as he entered the house at Gad's Hill, he seemed tired and silent. As he sat down to dinner, all present noticed that he looked very ill. They begged him to lie down. "Yes, on the ground," he said. These were the last words he ever uttered, and as he spoke he slipped down upon the floor. He never fully recovered consciousness, and next day, June 9th, 1870, Charles Dickens breathed his last. 5 days later he was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, where are buried so many of the greatest of England's dead. For days thousands came to visit the spot, and rich and poor alike looked upon his grave with tears. End of section 66. Recording by Samantha Miles. End of Tales from Dickens by Hallie Erminie RIVES.